My name is Laurel Kingston, and I am 32 years old. I have designed buildings that will still be standing after everyone in this story is gone. In 10 years of drafting contracts for other people's houses, I have never once signed anything without reading every line. Except one. That is the contract I want to tell you about. The notary's office smelled like toner and peppermint candy from a dish on the corner of her desk. Her name was Denise. She had a blue pen in one hand and a stamp in the other. She was moving through the family contract my parents had asked me to sign the way she moved through everything, fast, practiced, barely looking up. Then she stopped. I watched her go still on page 17. Not a pause, a full stop, the kind your body makes before your mind catches up to why. Her pen hovered an inch above the paper. The stamp never touched it. She read the paragraph once. Then she read it again, her lips moving slightly, the way people read when they do not trust their first understanding of something. When she finally looked up at me, her face had changed color. The way a face changes when it is deciding whether to say something it is not sure it is allowed to say. "I cannot notarize this," she said. "Not this page. Hire your own lawyer and do it before you sign another word." I asked her what was wrong with it. She would not tell me. She said it was not her place, that she only certified signatures, not intentions. She said whatever page 17 was asking me to agree to was not something a stranger in an office on a Tuesday afternoon should be the one to explain to me. I drove home with the contract on the passenger seat as if it might do something if I looked away for even a moment. My hands were steady on the wheel. My hands are always steady. It is the one part of my body I have trained never to shake, no matter what it is carrying. I did not know yet what page 17 said. I only knew that 6 months earlier none of this would have surprised me. My family had already taught me what they were capable of doing to get what they wanted from me. They just had not shown me the biggest part yet. To understand what my parents put on that page, you have to understand what came before it. You have to start where I started, begin with my aunt, a folder of paperwork, and a signature I gave away without reading it. 6 months before that afternoon in Denise's office, my life looked like something I had built on purpose, because it was... I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a small brick house 2 streets back from a greenway. I have a kitchen table I designed myself out of reclaimed oak and a stack of blueprints that never quite make it off the counter. I am an architect. I have been one for 8 years. For the last 3, I have worked at a firm called Bellhaven Design Studio, where I get to draw the kind of buildings that make ordinary streets feel like someone thought about the people who would walk down them. I like buildings because they do not pretend. A wall holds weight or it does not. A beam is rated for a load, or it is not. Nothing in architecture asks you to guess what it really means, and nothing in architecture waits until you have already agreed to something before it tells you the terms. My family is a different kind of structure entirely. The Kingstons have lived in and around Concord, just outside Charlotte, for 4 generations, but my grandfather, Harold Kingston, built a real estate company from a single strip of commercial lots in the 1970s. By the time he died, it owned 6 small shopping centers and more land than anyone in town liked to say out loud. When he passed, he left behind a family trust, meant to hold the bulk of that wealth until his grandchildren were old enough and steady enough to receive it without losing it. I was 14 when he died. I remember the funeral more than I remember him, if I am honest. Mostly a beige room full of relatives speaking about him the way people speak about someone they had stopped visiting years before he was gone. What I remember clearly is my father standing at the podium, and my Aunt Dorothy standing just behind his shoulder, already looking like she had somewhere else to be. Dorothy Kingston Vance is my father's younger sister, and for as long as I can remember, she has been the one who runs things, not owns things. Runs them. She was named trustee of the family fund the year my grandfather died, and in the 18 years since, She has treated that appointment less like a legal responsibility and more like a throne she happened to inherit along with the paperwork. Growing up, that meant small things at first. Whether I could take the summer art program in Asheville, or whether that money was better spent on something Dorothy called more practical, whether my college major counted as a real investment or a hobby she would mention lightly at every holiday dinner for 4 years, as though repetition might eventually change my transcript. She never controlled anything by force. She controlled it by making every choice I made feel like it required her permission first, even when it legally did not. And by the time I was old enough to understand the difference, the habit of asking Dorothy before I did anything that touched money or family had already settled into my bones. I had gotten better at it as an adult. I had my own income now, my own name on my own lease, a career Dorothy had called impractical exactly once, at my college graduation, and never mentioned again once the paychecks started clearing. I had a savings account nobody in my family had helped me build and a set of stamps on my passport nobody in my family had paid for. I told myself the old patterns belonged to a version of me that no longer existed, a 14-year-old in a hallway outside Dorothy's office, waiting to hear whether a summer program had been approved like it was a line item in someone else's budget. There was one detail from that summer I never fully let go of. I had been accepted into the art program in Asheville on my own, no help from anyone, a real acceptance letter with my name typed at the top. Dorothy sat me down at her kitchen table anyway, laid out 3 months of the trust's discretionary spending in neat columns, and explained, patiently, the way you would explain something to a child too young to understand math, that the program was not a wise use of family resources. I was not asking the trust to pay for it. My mother had already agreed to cover the fee herself, out of her own account, nothing to do with Dorothy at all. It did not matter. Dorothy called it a discussion. It functioned like a verdict. I did not go that summer, not because anyone forbade it outright, but because saying no to Dorothy, in that house, in that family, cost more than any of us were willing to spend out loud. I built my whole adult life, brick by brick, as a rebuttal to that kitchen table. Every choice I made without asking permission first felt like proof I had actually left. I got the call from her on a Tuesday morning in early spring while I was still holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold on my desk at Bellhaven. A set of elevation drawings was open on the second monitor, and half a sentence of feedback sat unsent in an email to a client. "Laurel," she said, in the voice she uses when she wants something to sound like an invitation instead of a summons, "I need you to come by the trust office this week. There are some things we should discuss about your future." I asked her what things. "Not on the phone," she said. "Thursday. Bring a clear afternoon." There was a pause after that. It was the kind Dorothy leaves on purpose, long enough that you fill it yourself with whatever worry serves her best. I did not fill it. I told her Thursday worked and closed the call. I sat for a moment with my hand still resting on the phone, feeling something I could not yet name settle low in my chest. I did not know it yet. That phone call was the first knock on a door I had spent years pretending was already closed. My family had never stopped believing they had a say in who I was allowed to become. I had simply stopped listening closely enough to notice they were still talking. The trust office occupied the second floor of a converted bank building on the main square in Concord. It was the kind of address that still had the old vault door bolted open in the lobby as a decoration, as if to remind everyone who walked in that this was a place built to hold things and not give them back easily. Dorothy's office looked exactly the way I remembered it from every uncomfortable conversation of my adolescence. Heavy furniture, a framed photograph of my grandfather hung on the wall behind her desk, positioned so his gaze fell just over the shoulder of whoever sat across from her, watching without quite watching. A manila folder waited in the center of the desk, squared perfectly to the edges, the way Dorothy squares everything before she uses it against you. "Thank you for making time," she said, though I had not really been given a choice about when, only the illusion of choosing to accept it. She gestured at the chair across from her. I sat. She opened with small talk that was not really small talk. Questions about Belhaven, about whether the firm was finally paying me what I was worth, about whether I had thought any more about the future. She used that phrase the way other people mention the weather, filler that was actually the entire point of the conversation. I answered carefully. I had learned to answer Dorothy since I was a teenager, giving her exactly enough to keep the visit moving without handing her anything she could use later. Then she opened the folder. "Your grandfather structured the trust in tears," she said, sliding a single page toward me, the page dense with the kind of legal language written to be skimmed instead of read. "Tier 1 distributions began when you turned 25. You know all that. Tier 2, the larger distribution, the one that actually matters, requires what the original documents call, quote, demonstrated alignment with family values and continuity of the family's interests," unquote. I asked her what that meant in practice, because I had asked her some version of that question for 18 years and had never once received an answer that held up under a second question. "In practice," Dorothy said, folding her hands. "It means the family needs to see that you are building a life that reflects well on what your grandfather worked for. Belhaven is a lovely little firm, Laurel, but it is not Kingston Realty. Your father is not getting younger. There is a place for you there. A real place. An ownership track. If you would simply stop treating the family business like something beneath you." I told her Belhaven was not beneath anything, that I had built a career there I was proud of, that I had no intention of leaving it to draft site plans for strip malls under my father's supervision. Dorothy's mouth tightened into the smile she uses instead of anger, because anger, in her mind, is something other people are allowed to have. "And there is the matter of your personal choices," she said, not looking at me directly when she said it, looking instead at the folder, as though the folder had brought it up and not her. "Mr. Reyes, the carpenter." I did not answer that. I had learned a long time ago that giving Dorothy a reaction was the same as handing her a tool, something she could turn around and use to prove whatever point she had already decided to make before I walked in. For a moment, I considered pushing back harder, laying out everything I had built without her permission, the client list, the design awards Belhaven had put my name on, the mortgage I paid on time every month from an account she had never once touched. I considered asking her, plainly, what exactly she thought Sam's profession disqualified him from, given that he owned his business outright and had never asked my family for a single dollar. I did none of it. I had watched enough Kingston holidays end in silence to know that Dorothy did not lose arguments so much as wait them out, letting you exhaust yourself against a position that never actually moved, and I did not have the afternoon to spend on a fight I already knew how it would end. She moved on smoothly, the way she always did when a silence told her more than an answer would have. She slid a second document across the desk, shorter, a single page with a signature line at the bottom, and told me it was simply an administrative update, something the trust's attorney required periodically to keep beneficiary records current. Nothing that affected my distributions one way or another. She said it the way she said most things that mattered, quickly, folded inside a sentence about something else, timed for a moment when I was still absorbing the larger conversation and had not yet caught my breath. I signed it. I want to be honest about that. I signed it the way you sign a form at a doctor's office, half listening, trusting the person handing you the clipboard to have told you the truth about what it was for. Dorothy took it back before the ink had fully dried, slid it into a different folder. and closed the meeting with a line about how much she hoped I would think seriously about my future. I did not know. Walking out of that building into the flat gray light of a Concord afternoon, that I had just handed my brother the exact tool he would need to hurt me. I only knew that my jaw ached from clenching it for 40 minutes, and that I wanted, more than anything, to get home to a house where no one required my alignment with anything at all. I sat in my car in the parking lot longer than I needed to, watching the old vault door catch the light through the lobby window, thinking about how strange it was that a room built to protect things had spent 18 years being used. Instead, to hold things over people's heads. I thought about Tier 2 and demonstrated alignment, and how carefully my grandfather's lawyers must have worded a document meant to outlive him, never imagining that the person entrusted to interpret it would learn to read every gray area as a lever. I did not call Sam on the drive home. I wanted to walk through my own front door first, into a house that belonged to no one's approval but mine, before I let the day's residue touch anything I actually loved. Sam Reyes did not come from a family that made you sign anything to prove you belonged in it. I met him 3 years ago, when Bellhaven partnered with his shop, Reyes Woodworks, on a restaurant build-out downtown, a job that needed custom shelving built to match specifications so exact that most contractors would have padded the estimate just to cover the headache. Sam did not pad anything. He read my drawings twice, asked 4 questions that told me he actually understood load distribution better than half the engineers I had worked with, and delivered the shelving 2 days early. Sanded so smooth I ran my hand along it in the finished space just to feel it. I asked him to coffee before I asked him anything about the shelving. He said yes before I finished the sentence. 3 years later, he still smells like sawdust and cedar oil more often than not. Still keeps a pencil behind his ear even when he is not working. Still calls his shop by its full name, Reyes Woodworks. The way some men say the names of children. He is 34. He is steady in a way that has nothing to do with being unexciting and everything to do with never once, in 3 years, saying one thing to my face and something different to someone else. He has never asked me for money. He has never asked me about the trust. When I told him, early on, that my family had money tied up in a fund I might inherit someday, he shrugged and said that was between me and my family. He went back to sanding a table leg as if the subject bored him, which, as far as I could tell, it genuinely did. Sam grew up the son of a machinist in Gastonia and learned to work wood from his grandfather on weekends before he learned to drive. He built his shop from a rented garage into a real storefront over 12 years of work nobody handed him. He talks about that history plainly, without performing humility and without hiding pride either. The way people talk who have never needed a family trust to tell them their life had value. Being around him, in those early months, felt like breathing air that had not already been measured out and rationed by someone else's approval. My family did not know what to do with a man who wanted nothing from them. I brought him to dinner at my parents' house that Friday, the same week as the meeting with Dorothy, mostly because the invitation had already been standing for a month and canceling would have required an explanation I did not have the energy to give. My mother, Patricia, cooked the way she always cooks for company she is quietly evaluating, a pot roast that took all afternoon, a table set with the good china that only comes out when someone is being measured against it. My father, Robert, said little at first, the way he says little at most family dinners, letting the conversation move around him like weather he had decided not to dress for. It was my mother who steered things, gently at first, asking Sam about his business the way you would ask a stranger about a hobby, complimenting the table he had built for us as a thank you gift the year before, and then, over the second helping of pot roast, asking whether he had ever considered a trade that offered more, her word, stability. Woodworking's been stable for me for 12 years, Mrs. Kingston, Sam said, easy, unbothered, the way he answers most things that are meant to unsettle him. I own the shop outright, no debt on it. That's more stable than most jobs with a name tag. My mother smiled the smile she uses when she has decided not to argue with something out loud. Dorothy, seated across from me, though I had not expected her to be there, added, almost idly, that stability was not always the same thing as suitability. She said families like ours had certain expectations about the kind of life a daughter builds. Expectations meant to protect what generations had worked to create. I felt my whole body go tight in the way it only does at that table. I told Dorothy evenly that Sam was the most stable, decent person I had ever built a life with. If the family's expectations required me to measure him against a spreadsheet, the expectations were the problem, not him. Nobody answered that directly. My mother changed the subject to a fundraiser at First Concord Church. My father asked Derek, my younger brother, seated at the far end of the table, how the new job was going. Derek, 27 and perpetually between one plan and the next, said fine. Just fine, working some things out in a voice that made me glance at him for half a second longer than the sentence deserved. Nobody at that table noticed me glance. I certainly did not think anything of it myself. Not that night. I only remember it now because I know what those 4 words were quietly sitting on top of. I wish, more than almost anything else in this story, that I had asked him what he meant right then, at that table, while the damage was still small enough to stop with a single honest conversation. Sam noticed something, though, even without knowing what, on the drive home, with the windows cracked to let out the smell of my mother's kitchen still clinging to both our coats. He reached over and rested his hand on my knee. He did not say anything for almost a mile. Then he said, quietly, that he had built enough custom cabinetry for enough families to know the difference between a house and a house that only performs being one. He said my family's dining room had the second kind of quiet. The kind built to be looked at rather than lived in. I laughed, because it was easier than agreeing out loud, and told him he saw more in an hour of pot roast than most people saw in a year. He shrugged, the way he does, and said wood does not lie to you if you know how to read the grain, and people are not so different once you learn to look for the same thing. I did not tell him about the folder Dorothy had opened 2 days earlier. I told myself there was nothing yet worth telling. A single signature on an administrative form was not the kind of thing you brought home and set on the table between 2 people who had just spent an evening being quietly measured by people who were supposed to love them without conditions. I know now that was the first small lie I told by omission in this story, and it would not be the last. There is a particular kind of loneliness that only shows up inside a family that has decided love is conditional on alignment, and it does not announce itself the way loneliness from absence does. It shows up at full tables. It shows up during pot roast and good china and everyone asking after your career in a tone that sounds like interest, until you notice how quickly the conversation turns back toward what they want from you. I grew up believing that was normal, because it was the only table I had. My mother would tell me, when I was young enough to still take it as comfort, that the Kingstons took care of their own. That family was the one thing money could not replace and the one thing that would always be there when everything else fell apart. I do not think she was lying. Exactly. I think she genuinely believed that taking care of someone and directing every choice they made were the same act, performed with the same love. And it took me until my late 20s to understand that a family can say the word love constantly and still mean something closer to control. I remember one specific evening from when I was maybe 16, sitting at that same dining table while my mother explained gently that the reason I had not been invited to a friend's birthday trip to the coast was that the family had, quote, made other plans for me that weekend. Those plans turned out to mean nothing more than a Kingston cousin's christening 2 counties over that I barely attended in any meaningful sense. standing at the back of a church in a dress my mother had chosen. I cried in the car afterward, quietly, so my father would not hear it over the radio. I did not understand yet that the trip itself was never really the point. The point was teaching me, early and often, that my time belonged first to the family's calendar and only second to my own life. A lesson repeated so many times across so many small occasions that by the time I was an adult, I had stopped noticing it was being taught at all. The week after the dinner with Sam, my parents hosted one of the small, semi-official family gatherings that happen a few times a year, ostensibly for no reason. Actually to keep everyone circling close enough to the trust that nobody forgets whose approval still matters. My mother called them family evenings. Dorothy called them check-ins, when she thought no one outside the family was listening. I had always privately called them audits. The week after the dinner with Sam, my parents hosted one of the small, semi-official family gatherings that happen a few times a year, ostensibly for no reason. Actually to keep everyone circling close enough to the trust that nobody forgets whose approval still matters. My mother called them family evenings. Dorothy called them check-ins, when she thought no one outside the family was listening. I had always privately called them audits. That particular evening, my parents' attorney was there. It struck me as slightly unusual even then, though I did not think hard about it in the moment. His name was Arthur Whitlock, a tall, silver-haired man in his late 60s who had represented my grandfather's businesses for decades and, by extension, had represented my family for longer than I had been alive. He did not say much. He sat near the window with a glass of iced tea he barely touched. He listened the way lawyers do, taking in far more than his face let on. I remember catching his eye once, across the room, while Dorothy was in the middle of a story about a Kingston Realty property she had personally saved from a bad tenant. It was a story I had heard some version of at least 4 times before. Whitlock was not looking at Dorothy. He was looking at me, briefly, with an expression I could not read at the time, and can only fully name now, in hindsight, as something close to concern, or perhaps regret. It was the look of a man who knows more than he is permitted to say and has made peace, uneasily, with staying quiet. I did not think about it again for weeks. I had no reason to. Whitlock had always been a fixture at Kingston family events, a piece of furniture in a good suit, present at every occasion without ever once, in my memory, saying anything that revealed what he actually thought about any of us. He had drafted my grandfather's will. He had drafted the trust documents Dorothy quoted at me like scripture. He had, I would later learn, drafted a great many things for my family that none of us had ever been shown in full. On that particular evening, sitting near the window with his untouched iced tea sweating a ring onto the side table, he looked, for just a moment, like a man carrying something heavier than his posture let on. Derek left early that night, citing a shift he had picked up. Though I noticed he did not say where, my mother pressed a plate of leftovers into his hands on his way out, the way she always did, and told him to call if he needed anything, the way she always did. I remember thinking, without any real weight behind the thought, that my parents worried about Derek in a different register than they worried about me, softer, quicker to excuse. The kind of worry that exists for someone you have already decided will need forgiving. What I understand now, looking back, is that a man like Whitlock does not attend a family evening by accident. He does not watch a niece across a crowded living room with that particular expression, unless something is already sitting on his desk that he is bound by every professional obligation he has ever taken seriously, not to discuss with the one person it will eventually hurt the most. I drove home that night thinking about nothing more complicated than how tired I was of being audited. I wanted, for once, to sit at a table where nobody was quietly measuring whether I still counted as one of them. I had no idea that the quietest man in that room was the one person who might have told me the truth, if only the family had let him. I did not know it would take 2 more betrayals, in 2 more forms, before I found my way back to him and finally asked the right question. I met Priya Anand almost by accident. At a Chamber of Commerce mixer, Belhaven sent me to represent the firm at one of those events with too much bad wine and too many name tags, held in a hotel ballroom that smelled faintly of carpet cleaner no matter how many candles the caterer lit to cover it. I recognized her before I could place why. She was standing near the dessert table, holding a small plate of nothing she seemed to be eating. And something about her face was familiar in that specific way. Faces are familiar when you have seen them once, briefly. In a professional context, you cannot quite locate. It took me most of a glass of wine to remember. She had been at the trust office the day of my meeting with Dorothy, at a desk near the entrance. The kind of desk assistants sit at, half hidden behind a monitor and a stack of folders. "You work for the trust," I said, once I had placed her and immediately regretted how it came out, blunt, almost accusatory. She smiled, unbothered. "Accounting, mostly. Priya. I keep the books current so Mrs. Vance doesn't have to think about numbers." There was something dry in the way she said it. A small, private joke she was not fully sure she should be telling a Kingston. We talked for longer than either of us probably meant to, the way strangers sometimes do at events like that, drifting past the professional small talk into something more honest simply because neither of us had anyone else in the room worth performing for. She told me she had been with the trust for a little over 2 years, hired straight out of an accounting program at UNC Charlotte, and that the work was steady and unglamorous, mostly reconciling statements and preparing quarterly reports that almost nobody outside the office ever read closely. She said Mrs. Vance was, in her words, particular. A boss who wanted every number to look a certain way before it left the building, though she was careful, even saying that much, to keep her tone light, professional, the tone of someone who liked her job and had no intention of complaining about it to a member of the family whose money she managed. I liked her immediately, in the easy, uncomplicated way you like people who have no stake in what you decide to do with your own life. I told her, without meaning to turn the conversation personal, that I had just come from one of those quarterly conversations myself, the kind where Dorothy explains at length what my grandfather's documents supposedly require of me. Priya's expression shifted, just slightly, the particular flicker of someone deciding in real time whether to say something. "Required, like Tier 2, she asked. "The family values language," I said yes, that exact phrase, and asked, half joking, whether she had ever actually read what it required. Given that she was the one who apparently kept the books current. "I've read the trust instrument a few times, cover to cover," she said. "Mostly out of boredom. Honestly, slow week, nothing on my desk. There's language in there about distributions being subject to trustee discretion. Sure, plenty of it. That part's real, but I don't remember anything about marriage, or careers specifically. I remember thinking it was actually pretty vague about what discretion even means, which I guess is the point of vague language, legally. But I don't remember a values test written out the way Mrs. Vance talks about it. Might be misremembering. It's a long document. She said it lightly, already half apologizing for the observation before she had finished making it. People do that when they think they've said more than their job asks of them. I did not press her further that night. I thanked her for the conversation and told her it was nice meeting someone outside the family who actually understood the paperwork. Then I let the subject drop into the general noise of the mixer around us. Someone from the Chamber's board pulled Priya away not long after that, wanting to introduce her to a vendor. I stood by the dessert table a moment longer, turning her words over and testing them against 18 years of Dorothy's certainty the way you test a beam you suspect might not actually be load-bearing. I told myself on the drive home that I was probably overreacting to one offhand comment from someone who had read the document only a few times, years apart, and might be misremembering a clause buried 40 pages in. I have run that reassurance back through my mind many times since. I still cannot decide whether I believed it that night or simply needed to, long enough to get myself through the drive without pulling over. I drove home that night with something lodged in my chest that had not been there that morning. A small non-specific weight. It was the particular feeling of hearing a sentence that does not match the version of reality you have been handed your entire life. I had spent 18 years believing Dorothy's interpretation of that trust, the way you believe weather, as a fixed condition of the world rather than a choice someone made and kept remaking to suit herself. For the first time, I wanted to see the actual document, not the version filtered through Dorothy's folder and Dorothy's voice, but the real language, cover to cover, the way Priya had read it on a slow week out of nothing more than boredom. I did not know yet how I would get it. Beneficiaries technically had the right to request a copy of the trust instrument. I remembered that much from some form I had signed years earlier without reading closely, though I also knew that any formal request would move straight across Dorothy's desk before it reached me. And I was not ready yet to hand her that particular warning. I only knew that the wanting itself, sharp and sudden, was the first real crack in 18 years of assuming my family's rules were rules, not a story someone told so often that everyone, including me, mistook it for law. I lay awake later that night longer than I meant to, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above the bed. I kept running Priya's sentence through my mind, the ease of it, no hesitation, no defensiveness, just a plain observation from someone with nothing to gain either way. That, more than anything, was what stayed with me. Dorothy always had something to gain. Priya, as far as I could tell, had absolutely nothing. I texted Priya 2 weeks later, telling myself it was a casual follow-up, that I was simply continuing a pleasant conversation from a mixer. I suspect she understood, from the way I phrased the question, exactly what I was asking. I said I had been thinking more about what she mentioned regarding the trust language, and asked, as lightly as I could manage over text, whether she would be willing to grab coffee and talk it through in more detail. She agreed, though her reply took longer to arrive than her first one had, a pause I noticed and understood better, once we were sitting across from each other at a small cafe near the trust office 2 days later. "I want to be careful here," she said, before I had even finished stirring cream into my coffee. "I'm not trying to get in the middle of anything with your family. I need this job." I told her I understood completely, that I was not asking her to do anything that put her position at risk, that I only wanted to understand, as a beneficiary, what the document I was theoretically bound by actually said. She nodded slowly, turning her own cup in a small circle on the table, weighing something. "I can't hand you a copy," she said finally. "That's not mine to give. And honestly, it would probably violate about 4 different things in my employment agreement, but I brought my own notes. I take notes sometimes when I'm reconciling year-end reports, just to keep track of which clauses affect which distributions. Nothing confidential, just my own shorthand." She slid a folded piece of paper across the table, her handwriting cramped and efficient, clearly meant for her own use rather than anyone else's eyes. I scanned it twice before I found the section she had underlined, a summary in her own words of the Tier 2 distribution language, referencing trustee discretion regarding, quote, "the beneficiary's demonstrated capacity for responsible financial stewardship," unquote, and nothing else. No mention of marriage, no mention of career path, family business, or continuity of family values. The exact phrase Dorothy had used in her office, as though reading it directly off the page. "That's it?" I asked. "That's the whole standard. That's the language on stewardship," Priya said. "There's more elsewhere, about timing, about how distributions can be delayed if there's litigation involving the beneficiary, stuff like that. But the values language, the marriage and career stuff Mrs. Vance mentioned to you, I went back and reread the whole document again last week, cover to cover, specifically looking for it, because honestly, our conversation at the mixer stuck with me too. I couldn't find it. I'm not saying it isn't there in some appendix I'm not thinking of. I'm saying I looked carefully, and I couldn't find it. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift inside my chest that felt less like anger and more like the floor of a room I had lived in my whole life, quietly proving itself to be a different shape than I had always assumed. "Why would she say it then?" I asked, not really expecting Priya to have the answer. If it's not actually in there, Priya was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. The way people choose words about their employer even when they trust the person they are talking to. "I don't know your aunt well enough to say for certain," she said. "But I do the books, Laurel. I see what discretion actually costs the beneficiaries who don't push back. And I see how much of that discretion runs directly through her office, unquestioned, every single quarter." She would not say more than that, and I did not push her to. I thanked her, folded her notes carefully into my bag like something fragile, and asked her, before we parted, to please let me know if she ever felt uncomfortable about anything I had asked her. That the last thing I wanted was to put her job in jeopardy over a family disagreement that was not hers to carry. She smiled at that, said she appreciated it more than I probably realized, and told me, almost as an afterthought while gathering her things, that she had always found it strange how much of the trust's discretionary language got interpreted the same direction every single time, toward keeping money and control exactly where it already sat. I drove back toward Charlotte with my hand steady on the wheel and my mind anything but steady, replaying 18 years of Dorothy's voice against a single page of someone else's careful handwriting. For the first real time as a grown woman, I understood exactly how much of my family's authority over me had never actually existed on paper at all. I thought about every holiday dinner where Dorothy invoked the trust like scripture, and about the conversations where I'd swallowed objections because arguing a legal document felt pointless. Something hardened in me during that drive, the last soft places I had left finally snapping shut. My phone buzzed twice before I had even reached the highway. Both times. It was Dorothy. The first message asked, without preamble, whether I had met with someone from the trust office recently. The second came less than a minute later and said she would appreciate a call when I had a moment. It was phrased like a request, but landed, as everything from Dorothy did, more like a summons. I understood immediately what had happened. Priya must have logged our meeting somewhere, or someone at the cafe had recognized one of us, or Dorothy simply kept closer tabs on her own staff's calendars than either Priya or I had accounted for. It did not matter which. What mattered was that Dorothy already knew I had gone looking, and I was about to find out exactly how she handled being questioned by someone she had spent 18 years training not to ask. I did not call her back that night. I sat in my driveway after I parked, engine off, Priya's folded notes still on the passenger seat. I stayed there a long time and thought about every version of this exact moment I'd lived through as a teenager. The specific dread of Dorothy noticing something before I was ready for her to notice it. I was 32 years old, sitting in my own car outside my own house, and my body was still reacting like the 14-year-old who once waited outside a kitchen table to hear whether a summer program had been approved. It was that recognition, more than Dorothy's messages, that finally made me call her back, not out of obedience, but because I refused to spend another night arranging my evenings around her silence the way I had so many times before. Dorothy did not ask me to come to the trust office this time. She came to my house unannounced on a Saturday morning while I was still in paint-stained clothes from touching up the guest bedroom trim. I mention the detail because I met her without armor. Without the composed, professional version of myself, I usually kept ready for family conversations. She stood on my porch in a blazer that looked wrong against the casual Saturday street around her, and asked, without any greeting first, whether I had been discussing trust matters with staff. I did not deny it. I had decided, somewhere on the drive home 2 nights earlier, that I was done pretending questions were the same thing as betrayal. I told her yes. I had spoken with Priya, and Priya had shown me her notes on the distribution language. Nowhere in those notes, and nowhere in 18 years of Dorothy quoting that document at me, had I ever seen the clause about family values, marriage, or career alignment that Dorothy presented as gospel in her office. For a moment, Dorothy's face slipped, almost imperceptible, the look of someone recalculating faster than she wanted anyone to see. Then it settled back into the composed mask she wears for everything. It's the same face I'd watched her put on at funerals and holiday dinners. The one she uses when she needs to look fully in control, even while she's been scrambling to catch up. I had never once in 18 years seen that mask slip and reappear so quickly. It told me more than anything Priya's notes had told me. Dorothy was not confused about what the document said. She knew exactly what it said, and exactly what it did not say, and had simply been counting on the fact that no one in this family had ever cared enough about the fine print to check. "Trustee discretion is broad by design, Laurel," she said. "Your grandfather wanted flexibility built into that document. Precisely so a trustee could exercise judgment about what serves the family's long-term interests. I have exercised that judgment consistently for 18 years. If Priya characterized that discretion to you in some narrow, technical way, she is not wrong, exactly. But she also is not the one who has spent nearly 2 decades interpreting your grandfather's intent." "That's not an answer," I said. "That's a justification for making up a standard that isn't written anywhere and telling me it's law." "It is not made up," Dorothy said, sharper now, the mask cracking at the edges. "It is interpretation, which is a legitimate exercise of my role. Whether or not a junior accountant 2 years into her career agrees with how I apply it," I told her as calmly as I could manage while my pulse hammered somewhere behind my ears, that I did not need her interpretation of my own life anymore, that I would continue working at Bellhaven, continue building a future with Sam, and continue making decisions about both without asking her permission first. Tier 2? Or no Tier 2? Dorothy studied me for a long moment on that porch, the particular look she gives you right before she decides a fight is not worth finishing in the open. "You should be careful," she said finally, her voice dropping into something quieter, almost gentler, which somehow made it land harder than if she had shouted. "You think this is between you and me. It has never been between you and me, Laurel. There are people in this family who are going to be very disappointed to hear you've decided to go digging through paperwork you don't fully understand. And I promise you, I am the easiest version of this conversation you are going to have." I asked her what that meant, what exactly she was threatening me with. She did not answer directly. She said only that she hoped, for my sake, that I would think carefully before I kept pulling on threads I did not know the shape of. Then she left, her heels sharp against my front walk as she climbed into a car that looked, as always, freshly detailed and slightly too large for the neighborhood. I stood on my porch for a long time after she drove off, paint still drying under my fingernails, replaying her last sentence over and over, trying to decide whether it had been a genuine warning or simply Dorothy's last available weapon, the threat of a fight she could no longer win outright. Sam found me still standing there 20 minutes later, coming around from the backyard with sawdust on his forearms from a Saturday project of his own, and asked, gently, what had happened. I told him most of it. The confrontation. Dorothy's strange closing warning, the way she had said there are people in this family in a tone that made the sentence sound bigger than herself. He listened the way he always listens, without interrupting, and when I finished, he said only that, in his experience, people who threaten you with vague, unnamed consequences are usually more afraid of something specific than they are willing to say out loud. I asked him what he thought Dorothy was afraid of. He said he did not know Dorothy well enough to guess, but in his experience fear almost always traced back to money, one way or another, and I should keep both eyes open for whoever was standing behind her, since she had made it fairly clear she was not standing there alone. I did not yet understand how literally true her words actually were, or how little, in the end, they had to do with her at all. My parents were the ones holding the shape she would not name. I would not learn that for months. A folder far heavier than anything Dorothy had ever handed me landed on my kitchen table, carried by the two people I trusted least to threaten me and most to protect me, in exactly the wrong order. The weeks that followed Dorothy's visit settled into a strange, watchful quiet. It was the kind of silence that follows a fight when you do not yet know if you have won or have only postponed something harsher. My mother called twice that first week. Neither call mentioned Dorothy directly, and both circled the subject the way she circles most things, asking about my schedule, whether I would make it to a church fundraiser at First Concord, and whether Sam and I had settled on a date yet, a question she had started asking with increasing frequency since the dinner where he had told her, evenly, that his shop was more stable than most jobs with a name tag. I answered her the way I had learned to answer most Kingston questions lately, honestly but without volunteering more than she asked for. My father did not call at all. That, more than anything Dorothy had said on my porch, told me something had shifted in a room I was not in. My father was not a man who avoided conflict by accident. He avoided it the way water avoids high ground, instinctively following whatever path required the least resistance. His silence in those weeks felt less like neutrality and more like a man who had been asked by someone to stay out of a conversation he did not fully understand. I threw myself into work instead, the way I have always thrown myself into work when my personal life gets too loud to sit inside comfortably. Belhaven had just landed a mixed-use development downtown, 4 stories of retail and residential space, wrapped around a courtyard I had been sketching in my head for weeks before the client even signed the contract. I spent long hours at my desk drafting elevations, running load calculations, losing myself in problems that actually had a correct answer, unlike almost everything happening inside my family that month. My firm's partner, a woman named Elaine Cho, who had hired me straight out of graduate school and had never once, in 8 years, asked me a single question about my personal life beyond the polite minimum, stopped by my desk one evening. She told me the courtyard sketches were the best work she had seen from me all year, and she said she hoped I would keep bottling whatever was fueling the late nights. I laughed more than the comment deserved, mostly from the relief of being praised for something that had nothing to do with alignment, or values, or a folder squared perfectly on someone else's desk. At Belhaven, a good idea was simply a good idea. Nobody required it to reflect well on 4 generations of a name I had not chosen. Sam noticed the hours. He never complained, but he started showing up at my office some evenings with takeout and would sit quietly in the guest chair while I finished a drawing. He did not need me to talk, just to be near enough that I remembered I did not have to carry it all alone. There is a particular kind of love that does not ask you to perform being fine. Sam had always offered me that kind without ever naming it as anything special. Only in contrast to a family that required constant performance did I fully understand how rare it was. I did not rejoin Kingston Realty. I did not stop seeing Sam. I did not apologize to Dorothy, and she, for her part, did not raise the subject again directly. I caught her watching me with a particular wariness at the one family gathering I attended that month. The wariness of someone recalculating how much ground she had actually lost. That gathering was smaller than the usual family evenings. Just my parents, Dorothy, and myself gathered ostensibly to plan the seating for a cousin's upcoming wedding, though the conversation barely touched the wedding at all. My mother spent most of the evening asking careful, roundabout questions about how I was feeling, whether the tension with Dorothy had resolved itself, whether I understood that family disagreements, however uncomfortable, always came from a place of love. I told her I understood that people could say the word love while doing things that did not feel like love at all, and she looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, before changing the subject to the wedding again. My father spent the evening mostly silent, refilling his glass twice, agreeing with whatever my mother said in the particular flat tone he used when he wanted a conversation to end faster than it was ending. What I did do, quietly, without telling anyone, including Sam, was start keeping my own file. Nothing dramatic, just a folder on my laptop where I saved screenshots of Priya's notes, a timeline of the conversation with Dorothy on my porch written out while it was still fresh. Small things I could not yet name a purpose for, but felt, in my gut, that I would eventually need. I had spent 32 years assuming my family kept better records of my life than I did. That spring, for the first time, I started keeping my own. I told myself the fight with Dorothy was over, a closed chapter, one uncomfortable confrontation that had ended, on balance, in my favor. Some nights I even let myself feel proud of it. The specific pride of having stood in one place on my own porch and refused to move for the first time in a family full of people who had spent my whole life expecting me to. I did not yet understand that Dorothy's warning on my porch had not been an ending at all. It had been the sound of one small door closing just before a much larger one opened. Somewhere inside my own family, without my permission and almost entirely without my knowledge. The next knock, when it came, would not come from Dorothy at all. It would come from someone I had never once, in 32 years, thought to keep a folder about. Sam proposed on a Sunday afternoon in his workshop, which is, in hindsight, exactly where he should have done it, in the one room that had never once required either of us to perform anything for anyone. I had come by to drop off lunch. Nothing planned, no signal that the day was different from any other Sunday we spent half at his shop and half at my house, trading off whose space got the afternoon. He was sanding something in the back corner when I walked in. A low bench he had told me weeks earlier he was building for a client. And he did not stop working right away, just told me to come look at something on the main table first. Casual, unhurried, the way he says most things. On the table sat a small wooden chest, no bigger than a shoebox, made from a wood I did not recognize at first. Dark and close-grained, with a hinged lid he had fitted so precisely that it closed without a sound. Our names were carved into the top, small, simple lettering, no flourish, exactly the kind of restraint I had come to associate with everything he made. "Open it," he said. And the tone of his voice told me, half a second before I lifted the lid, that this was not simply a gift. Inside, resting on a bed of wood shavings he had clearly arranged on purpose, was a ring, plain, a single stone, nothing showy, exactly what I would have chosen for myself if anyone had ever asked me what I wanted instead of what I was supposed to want. "I know your family does things a certain way," Sam said, before I could speak, watching me carefully. Diamonds and folders and paperwork and all of it measured against something I didn't want to give you anything that felt like another form to sign. I made the box myself. Out of walnut I've been saving for something worth saving it for. I figured you'd know the ring was real the same way you know good joinery is real. You just look at it and it holds. I laughed. And then I was crying. It was the exact strange mix that happens when someone gives you something you didn't know you'd been waiting your whole life for, and they offer it with no conditions attached. I said yes, but before he had technically finished asking. He laughed, wiped sawdust off his hands onto his jeans, then took the ring from the box and slid it onto my finger himself with the same careful precision he brought to everything, as if even this moment should be measured twice and cut once. We sat on the workbench for a long time afterward, not talking about the wedding, not talking about dates or venues or any of the logistics that would eventually need attention. We talked instead about nothing, about a chair he was designing, about a courtyard I was still sketching for the downtown project. We were two people who built things for a living, sitting in a room full of half-finished furniture, having just made something neither of us could measure, draft, or sand into shape, only feel. At some point I asked him how long he had been working on the box. He said 3 weeks, evenings mostly, after the shop closed, sanding a little further each night until the joints disappeared completely into the grain. He said he had almost told me twice, once when I stopped by unannounced and nearly caught him at it. He'd shoved the whole thing under a drop cloth and pretended to be working on something else entirely, badly enough that I had actually asked him if he was feeling all right. I remembered that evening. I had assumed he was simply tired. I told him so, and he laughed. He said that was the closest he had ever come to lying to me on purpose, and that he'd hated every second of it. I asked him, half joking, whether he had needed anyone's permission to buy the stone, which only made sense to someone who grew up like I did, where every significant purchase seemed to require Dorothy's signature, my mother's approval, or at the very least an audience. He looked at me like the question genuinely puzzled him. He said he had walked into a jeweler's, picked the one that looked like it belonged to me, and paid for it with money he had earned building tables for people who trusted his work enough not to ask him to justify it. Nobody's permission had entered into it at any point. I sat with that answer longer than the question deserved, turning it over the way I turn over a well-made joint, checking for the seam and finding, for once, that there was not one. I did not think, in that moment, about Dorothy, or the trust, or Tier 2 distributions, or the strange, unnamed warning she had left on my porch weeks earlier. For one full afternoon, I was simply a woman in love, sitting in a workshop that smelled like cedar, wearing a ring made real by someone who had never once asked my family's permission to love me. My phone was still on silent when Derek called that evening. I did not notice the missed call until much later, after Sam had walked me to my car and after I had driven home replaying the whole afternoon in my head. I was still smiling at red lights for no reason anyone behind me could see. When I finally checked my phone, there was a voicemail from Derek, his voice a little too casual, asking if I had a minute sometime that week. He said it was nothing urgent, just needed to run something by me, a small favor, paperwork stuff. Shouldn't take long. I called him back the next morning, still glowing enough from the engagement that nothing in his voice registered as a warning. I had no reason yet to hear one. Looking back, I think I needed that afternoon in Sam's workshop more than I understood at the time. Not just for the ring, but for the proof it gave me that love could exist without a folder attached to it, without discretion, without alignment, without anyone squaring papers on a desk before deciding what I deserved. I carried that proof with me into the next part of this story, the way you carry a good tool into a job you do not yet know is going to be harder than the last one. I had beaten Dorothy on her own ground, with her own document, and I walked away from that fight believing the worst of my family's hold over me had already shown its face. I did not yet understand that Dorothy's kind of harm, formal, distant, dressed up in legal language, was the smallest wound this family had waiting for me. The next one would not come wrapped in trustee discretion or family values. It would come from someone who shared my last name from birth, who had eaten dinner across from me my entire life, and who would use nothing more sophisticated than my own signature, given freely in love, to a man I trusted precisely because he was my brother. Derek picked a coffee shop near his apartment to meet, a small place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, the kind of casual setting that should have told me, in hindsight, that whatever he wanted did not feel like something he was proud enough of to discuss anywhere more formal. He looked tired when I got there, a little thinner than the last time I had really looked at him closely, dressed in a hoodie that had seen better years. He hugged me hello and congratulated me on the engagement with what seemed like genuine warmth. He asked about the ring and admired it the way he always admired things. Briefly, then moved on before the moment could ask anything of him. Then he got to the reason he had called. "I'm starting something," he said, stirring sugar into coffee he had not yet tasted. "A landscaping thing. Equipment, a truck, contracts with a couple of property managers I know. It's real, Laurel. I've got the whole plan worked out." I told him that sounded good, genuinely meaning it. Glad to hear him talking about something with actual shape to it after years of jobs that came and went without explanation. "The bank wants a co-signer on the equipment loan," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Just a formality," they said. "My credit's thin. No real history. But if someone with an established file co-signs, they'll approve it same day. I already talked to the loan officer. It's a small amount. I'd have it paid off within a year. Easy, once the contracts start bringing in money." I felt the old, automatic pull toward saying yes immediately, the reflex of a family that had trained me, my whole life, to treat a relative's need as an emergency requiring instant response. I asked him, instead, how much the loan was for. He named a number that struck me as larger than equipment for a landscaping business should reasonably cost, though I did not have enough knowledge of that industry to argue the specifics with any confidence. He explained it away smoothly: a truck, a trailer, a commercial mower, smaller tools, insurance up front. The kind of detailed list that sounds convincing precisely because it is specific, whether or not the specifics are actually true. I asked him why he had not gone to our parents for this instead, given how readily they usually stepped in for him. He looked away from me for a second, out the window at the parking lot, and said he had, actually, months earlier, and that Dad had said business was tight right now, that things were, in his words, more complicated than usual, and that Derek should try to stand on his own for once. I remember being struck by that answer at the time, not because it seemed suspicious, but because it seemed almost admirable. My father finally drawing a boundary I had never once seen him draw with Derek in 27 years. I wasn't thinking, sitting in that coffee shop, about asking what my father had meant by complicated. I wish now that I had. It was the first thread of the real story, dangling there in front of me. I let it pass because it was wrapped inside a sentence about my brother instead of my parents. "I don't need you to pay anything," he said, when he saw me hesitate. "I just need your name on the paperwork as a co-signer. If I make every payment on time, which I will, your name never actually costs you $1. It's just a formality. Like I said, the bank basically requires it for anyone under a certain credit threshold. I want to be honest about what happened next. I have turned it over in my mind many times since, trying to understand how I let it happen after everything with Dorothy had just taught me the exact opposite lesson. I was happy and distracted by wedding conversations Sam and I had barely started. I was still riding the specific high of an engagement that had asked nothing of me except to say yes to something good. And Derek was my brother, not my aunt, not a trustee wielding a document like a weapon. He was the boy who used to fall asleep in the back seat on long drives, who I had walked to his first day of kindergarten holding his hand because our parents were both working. Some part of me had never fully updated its file on him, had never quite let the version of Derek asking for help catch up to the version standing in front of me. 27 years old, thin and tired, and asking for something I did not fully understand. I signed the paperwork he had brought with him, folded into his jacket pocket like he'd been carrying it for exactly this moment. I did not read every page. I told myself I trusted him. I told myself it was a formality. I told myself the loan officer had explained it, that this was simply how small business lending worked for people without an established file. I drove home that afternoon feeling good about myself, the specific, quiet satisfaction of having helped my little brother the way an older sister is supposed to. I called Sam that evening and told him about it casually in the middle of a conversation about wedding venues. He asked, gently, whether I had read the loan terms myself before signing. I told him it was fine, that Derek had it handled, that it was just a formality. Sam did not push. He has never once, in 3 years, tried to tell me how to manage my own family. I have loved him for that restraint as much as I have loved anything else about him, even on the rare occasions, like this one, when I now wish he had pushed a little harder. It would be nearly 2 months before I understood exactly what I had actually signed. By then, the damage had already compounded well beyond anything either of us in that coffee shop could have imagined. The months after Derek's coffee shop request were, on the surface, the best stretch of my adult life so far. Sam and I set a wedding date, small, next spring, at a farm outside Charlotte that hosted maybe 60 guests at a time. Nothing that required my mother's guest list or my family's approval of the venue. My mother had, predictably, offered to help plan something larger that could accommodate the extended family. I suspected she meant several dozen names from her church committee she considered obligatory invitations. I told her, gently but firmly, that Sam and I wanted something small and that we had already chosen the venue. We would send her the details once they were finalized. She did not push, though I heard, in the particular flatness of her response, the sound of a woman filing away a disappointment to raise again later, at a moment better suited to her purposes. We spent evenings at his shop after hours, him sketching furniture designs he wanted to build for our new house, me sketching the house itself. Half joke and half genuine ambition, a low, modern structure with a wall of windows facing the woods. The kind of home I had drawn 100 times for other people and never once let myself imagine drawing for my own life. Some nights we did not talk about the wedding at all, content just to sit in the same room while I revised drawings and he oiled a tabletop. 2 people building parallel futures that had, somewhere along the way, become the same future entirely. Reyes Woodworks was growing too, steadily, the way Sam did everything. He had picked up 3 new commercial clients that spring, restaurants and boutique retailers who wanted his exact kind of custom work, precise, warm, built to last decades instead of a few trend cycles. The shop itself, the actual physical space, had started to feel cramped under the new volume. And one evening, walking the floor together after closing, sawdust settling gold in the last of the daylight through the windows, he told me he had been looking at a property 2 lots down, a larger building, room to add a second bay and hire on a junior carpenter he had been mentoring informally for a year. It'd mean taking out a mortgage on the new space, he said, running a hand along a workbench that had clearly outgrown the shop it sat in. First real debt I've ever carried in this business. Feels strange, honestly, after 12 years of paying cash for everything. He said it the way he said most admissions, plainly, no performance attached. A man simply reporting a fact about his own life, rather than asking anyone to feel a particular way about it. I told him it sounded like exactly the kind of strange that meant something was working, that businesses that never grow enough to need a mortgage are usually businesses that stopped dreaming a while ago. He laughed, said that sounded like something out of one of my architecture magazines, and asked, half serious, whether I would help him put together the loan application when the time came. Since I understood building costs and zoning better than any banker he had ever dealt with, I said, of course, meaning it completely, already picturing the two of us at my kitchen table with a legal pad, sketching out projected revenue and build-out costs the way we had sketched our future house. Together, on our own terms. Answering to no one but a loan officer who cared only about numbers and not about family values or demonstrated alignment with anything. We spent 3 separate evenings at that kitchen table over the following weeks, spreadsheets open on my laptop, a stack of Sam's invoices from the past year fanned out beside a pot of coffee, neither of us finished before it went cold. I liked that work more than I expected to. The specific satisfaction of applying my professional skills to something that was actually ours, translating square footage and zoning setbacks into numbers a bank would trust. Watching a plan take shape on paper, the same patient way I watched a building take shape from a foundation. Sam kept a small notebook the whole time, tracking every question the loan officer raised, crossing items off in pencil as we resolved them. And by the second week of summer, our application folder was thicker than any single document Dorothy had ever slid across her desk toward me. And it belonged, every page of it, to no one but us. We started the paperwork together in early summer, gathering financial statements, business projections, 3 years of Reyes Woodworks tax returns. Everything a bank would reasonably want to see before extending a commercial mortgage. Sam's side of the application came together cleanly, exactly what you would expect from a man who had run a debt-free business for over a decade. My side, the part where I would be listed as a co-applicant given our joint plans for the property, required nothing more complicated, I assumed, than the usual documentation. Pay stubs, tax returns, a credit pull that had never once, in my adult life, given me a single moment's worry. I remember the specific lightness of that summer. The two of us were building something together that belonged entirely to us. No folder, no discretion clause, no Dorothy watching from across a desk to decide whether we had earned it. Sam would sometimes catch me smiling at nothing in the middle of an evening, hunched over a spreadsheet, and ask what was funny. I would tell him nothing was funny, that I was simply happy in the plain, uncomplicated way I had spent most of my 20s assuming was reserved for other people's families and not my own. I did not yet know that somewhere behind that lightness, quietly, a number was accumulating on a piece of paper with my name on it, a number that had nothing to do with anything I had actually spent. The bank pulling my credit for our joint application was about to become the exact moment everything I thought I understood about my own financial life would come apart. We submitted the full loan application in the second week of July. The loan officer, a brisk, friendly man named Greg Whitfield at a regional bank Sam had used for years, told us to expect a decision within 10 business days, the standard turnaround for a commercial mortgage of that size. I did not think about the application much during that waiting period. Bellhaven's downtown project had moved into permitting, which meant long days at City Hall meetings and longer nights revising drawings to satisfy a zoning board that seemed to invent a new concern every session. Between that and finalizing wedding details, my attention was stretched thin enough that I mostly trusted the process to move forward the way processes usually do, quietly, in the background, until someone calls to tell you it's finished. Sam checked in on the application more than I did, calling Greg once midweek just to confirm they had everything they needed. He reported back to me over dinner that everything seemed to be moving along fine, no concerns raised, nothing unusual. I remember feeling almost smug about it in a quiet, private way. The particular satisfaction of watching a process built entirely on merit move forward without anyone needing to call in a favor or produce a trust document to make it happen. I told Sam, half joking, that this was what normal felt like, applying for something and simply waiting to hear whether you qualified. No discretion clause, no interpretation, no aunt deciding what you deserved. He laughed and said he had never once thought of a mortgage application as a romantic milestone before meeting me, and that he was going to need time to adjust to how thoroughly I had redefined the term. Greg called on a Thursday afternoon, and I could tell from the first few words of his voice that something had gone differently than expected. "I want to walk you through this carefully," he said, "because I don't think it's what either of you was anticipating." He explained that Sam's portion of the application had come through clean, exactly what they had projected. Strong revenue history, no red flags, an easy approval on his side alone. My portion, however, had triggered a hold. My credit report showed an open revolving account with a balance significantly higher than my typical spending patterns would suggest. Opened within the past several months and currently near its limit, its payment history had, as of the most recent reporting cycle, slipped from current to 30 days late. I told him there had to be a mistake. I did not carry revolving debt of any kind beyond a single credit card I paid off in full every month. It was a habit so consistent it had become almost a point of professional pride. The kind of discipline you develop when you spend your working life double-checking numbers for a living. "I understand," Greg said gently, in the voice of someone who has clearly delivered this particular kind of news before. "I'd recommend you request your full credit report directly and go through it line by line. Sometimes these things are clerical errors, wrong account matched to the wrong file. Sometimes there's something else. Either way, until it's resolved, I can't move forward on the joint application as submitted." I asked Greg, my voice steadier than I felt, whether he could tell me anything more about the account itself, the lender, the exact opening date, anything that might help me understand how a debt I had never incurred had attached itself to my name. He said he could see the basics on the credit report pull, a commercial equipment lender, a balance north of $40,000, an account opened in early spring, but that the details of who had actually drawn on the funds would only be visible to me directly, through the lender. Once I contacted them with my own identification, he said it kindly, clearly aware that whatever he had just told me had landed somewhere far heavier than a routine underwriting hiccup, and told me to call him back once I had more information, that Sam's approval would hold on file in the meantime, waiting for mine to catch up. I hung up the phone in my kitchen, standing at the counter where Sam and I had spent 3 evenings building a case for our own future, and felt something cold and unfamiliar settle into my stomach, a specific physical dread that had nothing to do with numbers on a page and everything to do with the sense, sudden and total, that something in my life had quietly gone wrong without my permission or my knowledge. I pulled my credit report that same evening, sitting at the same kitchen table, Sam beside me with his hand resting on my knee the way he had on the drive home from that first dinner with my parents. There it was exactly as Greg had described, an account I had never opened, a balance I had never spent, a payment history sliding toward delinquency on a debt that was, according to every record I could find, entirely and unmistakably mine. The account had been opened 4 months earlier. I sat with that date for a long moment before the memory surfaced, unwelcome and complete, of a coffee shop with mismatched chairs, a folded stack of paperwork pulled from a jacket pocket, and my own signature given freely. On a page I had not read closely enough to understand what it was actually asking of me. Sam watched my face change while I stared at the screen, and asked, carefully, what I had found. I could not answer him right away. I sat there running the math over and over, the timeline lining up too neatly to be coincidence, the number on the screen too close to the figure Derek had named across that table. Equipment, a truck, a trailer, insurance up front. I remember thinking, absurdly, of the specific way Derek had slid the paperwork toward me, folded once, like something he had rehearsed handing over. And I felt the particular nausea of realizing that the brother I had trusted without a second thought had used the exact same currency my aunt had tried and failed to use against me weeks earlier. My own signature, my own good name, spent on my behalf without my full understanding of the cost. I did not sleep much that night, and by the time the equipment lender's customer service line opened the next morning, I was sitting in my car in the Bellhaven parking lot, phone in hand, arriving 20 minutes early to work simply so I could make the call somewhere private, away from a kitchen table that had, overnight, stopped feeling like a safe place to have this particular conversation. It took nearly 40 minutes on hold, transferred twice, before I reached someone with actual access to the account file. The representative was polite and procedural, reading from a script with the practiced cadence of someone who took calls like mine every day. She confirmed the balance, confirmed the delinquency, and after I verified my identity with enough security questions to make my hands sweat, confirmed the equipment the loan had actually financed: a commercial mower, a used pickup truck, older than the one Derek currently drove, financed at an interest rate that made my stomach turn even before I understood the rest of it: a trailer. And a fourth line item, larger than the other three combined, was categorized simply as a working capital advance with no equipment attached. Just cash. It had been drawn down within the first 2 weeks of the account opening. I asked her to repeat the interest rate on the account, certain I had misheard it the first time. I had not misheard it. It was the kind of rate reserved for borrowers with thin credit files and no collateral to speak of, the exact category Derek would have fallen into on his own. It only made sense once I understood the lender had never actually been lending to Derek at all. They had been lending against my credit history, my income, and a decade of on-time payments. They were charging accordingly for the privilege of my name being the one that mattered on the file. I asked whether the landscaping business itself, the one Derek had described in such specific, confident detail across that coffee shop table, actually existed in the lender's records. Any registered LLC, a business license, anything. The representative said she could see no such entity listed anywhere on the account. Only the equipment and cash advance, financed under my personal guarantee. I sat with that for a long moment, the specific silence of understanding. Even the small, concrete details Derek had offered me, the property managers, the contracts already lined up, might never have been real at all. I asked her, as calmly as my voice would allow, whether she could tell me who had drawn on the funds, whether there was any record of where the working capital advance had actually gone. She said she could not share that level of transaction detail over the phone for privacy reasons. When I asked directly, she confirmed the account itself listed 2 names: myself as the primary signer and guarantor, and Derek Kingston as the authorized business operator on the account. I thanked her and ended the call, then sat in my car with the phone still warm in my hand. Something in my chest reorganized into a shape I did not yet recognize. Not quite anger, not quite grief. More like the vertigo of realizing a person you trusted completely had been a stranger wearing a familiar face the whole time. I texted Derek before I had fully decided to. I asked him to meet me that evening. No explanation, just a time and a place at my house instead of the coffee shop. I did not want whatever was about to happen between us to happen in public, surrounded by strangers who would never know what any of it actually cost. He agreed immediately, too quickly. I thought later. The response of someone who had been half expecting this message for weeks and had simply been waiting to see how long it would take to arrive. He asked, in a follow-up text a few minutes later, if everything was okay, a question that struck me, even in the middle of my own rising anger, as almost impressively hollow given what I suspected he already knew. I went into Bellhaven that morning and sat through a full day of meetings I barely remember. I nodded at the right moments and contributed enough to the zoning board conversation that no one seemed to notice anything was wrong. Running on the autopilot, 10 years of professional composure had trained into me. Elaine stopped by my desk once, mid-afternoon, and asked, lightly, whether I was feeling all right, that I looked a little pale. I told her I had not slept well, which was true enough to pass as a full answer, and she did not press further. Letting me disappear back into a set of drawings I was not actually seeing, I called Sam at lunch, sitting alone in my car again, and told him everything: the interest rate, the missing business license, the 2 names on the account. He was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of its usual easy warmth in it, only a kind of controlled, careful anger I had heard from him exactly once before, the day a subcontractor had tried to shortchange one of his junior carpenters on a job site. He asked whether I wanted him there that evening when I talked to Derek. I told him no, gently, that this was a conversation I needed to have alone, one Kingston to another, without an audience to perform composure for. He did not argue, though I could hear, even over the phone, how much it cost him to agree. It was only driving home that evening, watching the light go gold and then gray over the Charlotte skyline, that I let myself feel the full weight of what I already knew was coming. A conversation with my little brother that neither of us, I suspected, would be able to walk back from once it started. Derek arrived at my house a little after 7, still in the same kind of tired hoodie he had worn to the coffee shop months earlier. And I saw, the moment he stepped through my door, that some part of him already knew exactly why I had called this meeting. I did not offer him coffee. I did not sit him down gently the way I might have a few months earlier. I set my laptop on the kitchen table, the credit report open on the screen, the itemized loan details from that morning's phone call written out beside it in my own handwriting. The same instinct that had made me start keeping a folder about Dorothy now turned, without hesitation, toward my own brother. "There's no landscaping business," I said, before he had even fully sat down. "There's no LLC. There's no property manager contracts. There's a mower, a truck, a trailer, and a cash advance almost twice the size of all 3 combined, and none of it has your name on it as the responsible party. It has mine." Derek's face went through several expressions in quick succession, the reflexive denial rising first, visible in the way his mouth opened to argue before anything had actually left it, followed almost immediately by something closer to resignation, the specific look of a person who has run out of road on a lie they never fully believed themselves. "I was going to pay it back," he said, quiet, not quite meeting my eyes. "I swear, Laurel, I was going to have it handled before you ever needed to know any of this," I asked him, my voice steadier than I felt, where the money had actually gone, since it clearly had not gone toward a landscaping business that did not exist. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee mug in slow circles on my table the way he always does when he is deciding how much of the truth he can afford to tell. Then he told me, not landscaping equipment, a debt from a poker game that had gone badly wrong the previous winter, owed to people he described, vaguely, as not the kind you could simply ask for more time. A used truck he had actually needed to keep his current, more honest, part-time work possible. A few months of rent he had fallen behind on and been too embarrassed to admit to our parents, who, he reminded me, had already told him once that year they could not keep bailing him out. "You could have told me the truth," I said. I heard my own voice crack on the word truth, the first real break in the composure I'd walked in determined to keep. "I would have helped you figure something out. I would have sat with you and looked at the actual numbers, the way I do for a living. Derek, instead you handed me paperwork folded in your jacket pocket and let me sign my whole financial life away. You knew, you had to know, that I trusted you enough not to read it carefully." "I knew you'd say no if I told you the real amount," he said, and for the first time there was relief in his voice, the tired relief of someone who had been carrying a lie alone and could finally stop performing it. You've been so careful your whole life. Laurel, Dorothy's little golden rule follower, doing everything right, never asking for anything. I figured you had room. I figured it wouldn't actually cost you anything if I just made the payments on time. I told him, as evenly as I could manage, that he had not made a single payment on time, and that the account was already 30 days delinquent. I said it had just cost me the mortgage on my own future home, the one Sam and I had spent 3 evenings building a case for at this exact table. I watched that land on him, watched something in his face genuinely crumple for the first time since he had walked in. Underneath the anger, I felt something that surprised me more than the anger itself. A flash of grief for the boy who used to fall asleep in the back seat on long drives, now sitting across from me as a 27-year-old man who had learned somewhere along the way, in a family that taught all of us strange lessons about what love was supposed to cost, that using someone's trust was easier than earning their help honestly. He apologized. I believed the apology in the moment, even as I knew it changed nothing about the number on my credit report. I told him I needed him gone that night. Starting the next morning, a real plan for fixing what he had done. Not promises, not vague timelines, an actual plan with numbers, the kind of plan our own family had never once modeled for either of us. He left a little after 9. I sat alone at my kitchen table for a long time afterward, staring at the credit report still glowing on my laptop screen. I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that Dorothy's harm and Derek's harm were not the same shape of wound at all. Dorothy had used a document, distant and institutional, something I could read and refute with another document of my own. Derek had used something far more intimate and far harder to defend against. He had taken the specific, unguarded trust you extend to someone because they shared your childhood bedroom wall, because you taught them to ride a bike in the same driveway you learned on yourself, because some deep, uncomplicated part of you still pictures them as 7 years old and incapable of real harm. Long after the math has stopped supporting that picture, I understood, sitting there, why the second wound had landed so much harder than the first, even though Dorothy's number, on paper, might have eventually cost me more. Dorothy had tried to control my future. Derek had spent, without asking, a part of my past, the specific foolish faith I had always kept in reserve for him alone. I had absolutely no idea. Not yet. How much deeper this particular family was capable of cutting, or how small this evening's betrayal would eventually look, standing next to the one still waiting for me at the very end of that year. I called Maya the next morning before I had even finished my coffee. Maya Alston and I met in college. Assigned as roommates our first year at a school neither of us particularly wanted to attend, and stayed close through every version of adulthood that followed. Her through law school and a demanding first decade at a corporate firm downtown, me through architecture school and the slow, steady climb toward the career I had now. We were not related by blood, which had always struck me, especially in years like this one, as one of the more reliable facts of my life. Maya had never once needed a shared last name to show up for me. She had met my family exactly twice in 12 years of friendship, both times at events I could not avoid inviting her to, and both times driving home afterward. She had asked me some version of the same careful question, phrased differently, but circling the same observation, whether I ever noticed how much of what my family called concern actually functioned like control. I had always deflected those questions gently in the past, telling her every family had its own particular language, that mine simply ran a little more formal than most. I did not deflect this time. I had run out of formal explanations for what my family's language actually cost. She listened to the whole story without interrupting, with the specific attention she brings to everything, whether it is a multi-million-dollar contract dispute at her firm or her best friend's kitchen table crisis. When I finished, she asked me to send her everything, the credit report, the lender's contact information, the itemized loan detail, all of it. Before she said another word about strategy. "First thing," she said, once she had scanned through what I sent, "you need to dispute the delinquency directly with the credit bureaus, formally, in writing, today, if you can manage it. That stops the immediate bleeding on your score while we sort out the rest. Second thing," she continued, "you need Derek's cooperation in writing, not an apology over coffee, a signed statement acknowledging he opened the account, that the funds were used for his personal expenses, that he understands and accepts sole financial responsibility for repayment going forward. It won't automatically remove your name from the loan itself. That requires the lender's cooperation too. But it gives you something concrete if this ever needs to go further than a family conversation." I asked her, quietly, what she meant by further. "I mean, if he stops paying again," she said, gently, but without softening the fact of it. "I mean, if this happens a second time. I've watched enough of these situations, Laurel, professionally and personally, to know that people who do this once rarely stop after the first conversation. Not because they're monsters, usually, but because the first conversation taught them the family absorbs it, either way. You need paper that protects you if that happens again, even if you're hoping, right now, that it won't." I sat with that assessment longer than I wanted to, recognizing in it an uncomfortable echo of exactly the pattern I had spent 32 years living inside without naming it. A family that absorbed harm quietly, repeatedly, and called the absorbing love. Maya walked me through the practical steps over the following days, drafting the credit dispute letters herself and sending them out under her firm's letterhead, which she said tended to move bureaus faster than an individual complaint ever did. She reviewed Derek's signed acknowledgement line by line before I let him sign it, catching a vague clause in his first draft that would have let him argue. Later, he had only agreed to repay half the balance. She did all of it without charging me a cent, waving off every attempt I made to pay her properly, telling me, more than once, that this was simply what people who actually loved each other did for each other. No folder required, no discretion clause, no interpretation left up to anyone's convenience. Derek signed the revised statement without much argument. Once Maya's red line made the original loophole impossible to miss. He looked smaller somehow, sitting across from me in Maya's conference room. He was signing a document with his own name attached to a consequence he could no longer talk his way around. I did not enjoy watching it. I had expected, walking in, to feel some satisfaction in finally having the paperwork on my side of a family dispute for once. Instead, I mostly felt tired, the particular exhaustion of a person who had spent a month doing damage control for a mess she never made. I remember sitting in her office one evening. The credit dispute letters finally sent. Derek's signed statement finally secured. Feeling something close to steady for the first time in weeks. Maya poured us both a glass of wine from a bottle she kept in a desk drawer for exactly this kind of evening, and told me, watching me carefully over the rim of her glass, that she had one more piece of advice, unrelated to Derek entirely. "Start paying closer attention to your parents," she said. "Not because I know anything specific. You've told me about Dorothy's document, and now this. And both times your parents have stood just off to the side, saying almost nothing and doing almost nothing to stop either one. That's not neutral, Laurel. In my experience, that's usually a choice. I did not have an answer for her that night. I told her, honestly, that my parents had always run hot and cold in ways I had learned to read as personality rather than pattern. My father's silence, my mother's careful redirection of every hard conversation toward church committees and wedding plans. Maya just nodded, unconvinced. She told me she had built an entire career reading contracts for the sentence nobody wanted to say out loud, and that families, in her experience, worked exactly the same way. I only knew, driving home, that her words had settled into the same place Dorothy's warning had settled weeks earlier. It was a small, cold seed of suspicion I was not yet ready to fully examine, waiting for the moment, months away when it would finally come due. I told my parents about Derek's loan 3 weeks after the confrontation at my kitchen table, longer than I probably should have waited. I had wanted the credit dispute resolved first, the signed statements secured, some measure of ground already recovered before I brought the story into a room where I knew, from long experience, the facts would immediately start bending to fit whatever version made everyone else most comfortable. I told them on a Sunday afternoon at their house. I sat in the same living room where I had spent so many childhood evenings being quietly measured against some standard I was never fully shown. On the same striped sofa beside the brass lamp, my mother never let anyone move an inch from its corner table. My mother listened with her hands folded in her lap, her expression arranging itself into the specific, practiced concern she brings to any story that reflects poorly on the family. My father sat in his usual chair, saying nothing, the way he says nothing at most difficult conversations, letting the silence do the work he did not want to do himself. When I finished, my mother's first question was not about me, it was about Derek. "Is he all right?" she asked. "This must be so hard for him, carrying that kind of shame." I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that Derek was fine, that Derek had a signed agreement now to repay the debt he had opened in my name, and that the person she might consider asking about first, given the circumstances, was me, the one whose credit score had just been damaged, whose mortgage application had been delayed, whose trust had been spent without permission. "Of course we're concerned about you too, Laurel," she said, in the tone she uses when she wants a sentence to sound like agreement while actually functioning as a correction. "I only meant he's young, he's still finding his footing. You've always been so much more, I don't know, capable than he is. It's not an excuse, obviously, but I think we all need to be gentle with him right now." I felt something familiar tighten across my chest, the specific, old sensation of watching my own harm get quietly reframed as someone else's tragedy before I had even finished describing it. I had felt some version of this sensation my entire childhood, watching Derek's small failures get absorbed and excused while my own small failures, on the rare occasions I had any, got filed away as evidence for whatever argument Dorothy or my mother wanted to make about my character later. I had simply never had the specific vocabulary for it before. Not until I sat there as an adult, watching it happen to a real financial injury instead of a missed curfew or a disappointing report card. I asked my father directly, since he had said almost nothing, what he thought Derek should do to make this right. He shifted in his chair, glanced briefly at my mother, and said only that families worked things out. He said it was not the kind of thing that needed lawyers and formal statements between siblings, and that surely Derek and I could handle it between ourselves without turning it into something adversarial. I told him Maya was not adversarial. She was the reason I had any protection at all right then, since neither of my parents had offered any when I walked into their living room and told them their son had put my financial future at risk to cover a gambling debt he had been too embarrassed to admit to them directly. My mother's face changed at that. Quick, controlled, the specific flicker of someone absorbing information they clearly already possessed and had chosen not to share with me. "He told us about some of his difficulties," she said carefully. "We didn't know the details. We certainly didn't know he'd gone to you for money. I asked her what he had told them, and when, and she deflected, the way she always deflects, circling back to how important it was. Right now." for the family to stay united, to not let one difficult season turn into permanent damage between siblings who would need each other again someday. I asked my mother, plainly, whether she and my father had known Derek was struggling financially for some time. She hesitated before answering, a hesitation I noted and filed away without fully understanding its weight yet, and said only that Derek had come to them a few times over the past year, asking for smaller amounts here and there, and that they had helped when they reasonably could, though money had, in her words, been tighter for the family lately than usual. I asked her what she meant by tighter. She waved the question away. The specific gesture she uses to end a subject she has decided has gone on long enough, and said it was nothing I needed to worry about, that every business had its cycles, that Kingston Realty had weathered worse years than this one, and would weather this one too. I did not push further that evening. I had already spent every reserve of patience I owned on the larger fight in that living room. I filed her answer away next to the hesitation, two small and strange details sitting quietly in the back of my mind, waiting for a context I did not yet have to make sense of either one. I left their house that evening angrier than I had been at Derek himself, a colder, more disorienting anger, because Derek's betrayal had at least made a kind of desperate, selfish sense to me by the time I understood the shape of it. My parents' response made no sense at all unless I let myself consider something I wasn't ready to examine fully. That protecting Derek, and protecting the family's image of itself, mattered more to them than protecting me, and that this wasn't new or a mistake but a pattern I had simply never been forced to see so clearly before. My grandmother Vera called 2 days after that Sunday at my parents' house, and I remember answering with the specific bracing you develop when a family phone call has recently stopped meaning anything good. Vera Kingston is my father's mother, 79 years old and a retired schoolteacher who spent 31 years teaching 4th grade at the same elementary school in Concord before she retired. Since my grandfather Harold died, she has lived in a small, tidy house on the edge of town that still smells faintly of the chalk dust she swears clung to her clothes for a decade after she stopped teaching. She is the one Kingston I never once had to guard myself around, the holiday visit I looked forward to rather than endured. I felt something in my shoulders loosen the moment I heard her voice. "Danny told me some of it," she said, using the name only she still called my father, a habit from decades before the rest of us knew him only as Robert. "About your brother and that loan. I won't pretend I know all the details, but I know enough to guess how you must be feeling." I told her most of the story, more than I had told anyone outside Sam and Maya. I was comforted by the particular ease of talking to someone who had never once in my life tried to turn a conversation into a weapon against me. Vera listened the way she must have listened to hundreds of 9-year-olds over 3 decades, patient, unhurried, occasionally making a small sound of acknowledgement that let me know she was still fully present. When I got to the part about my mother's reaction, the immediate turn toward Derek's feelings instead of my own injury, Vera made a small, sharp sound of disapproval. It told me, more clearly than any lecture could have, exactly where she stood. "Patricia has always confused managing a room with caring for the people in it," she said, not unkindly, simply stating something she had apparently observed for a long time. "I love your mother, Laurel. I want you to know that before I say anything else. But she learned somewhere along the way that keeping the peace and keeping people safe were the same task. I've watched that mistake cost this family more than she realizes, more than once." When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said something that surprised me, given the conversation we had just had. "I've been thinking about your grandfather's papers a great deal lately," she said. "More than usual. I mean, there's a particular thing that's been sitting wrong with me for a few years now, and I don't know quite what to do with it. So I suppose I'll just tell you and see if it sits wrong with you too." She told me about the paper mill. a smaller piece of Harold's original holdings, something he had bought decades earlier as a modest side investment. Nothing as significant as the shopping centers or the main body of Kingston Realty. Vera remembered it clearly because Harold had been unusually sentimental about it. An old story about a friend from the war who had first suggested the purchase. "Your father sold it," Vera said. "A few years back now. Sold it fast, from what I understand. Faster than a sale like that usually goes, and for less than I would have expected, given the land alone was worth something. I asked him about it at the time. He told me it wasn't performing well anymore, that the industry had changed, that it made sense to simplify the estate. I didn't think much of it then. I suppose I trusted him the way you trust your own children, right up until you have a reason not to." I asked her what had changed, why it was sitting wrong with her now. "Because that money never showed up anywhere I could see it," she said, her voice quieter now, more careful. "Not in anything your father's built since. Not in anything I've noticed change about how your parents live, which, if anything, has gotten more modest these last few years, not less. It never sat right with me either that a man could sell off a piece of his father's legacy and somehow have less to show for it afterward. Not more. I don't have proof of anything. Laurel, I want to be honest about that. I'm an old woman with a bad feeling and a fondness for looking too closely at things nobody asked me to look at. But I thought, given everything else going on, you should know it's a feeling I've been carrying." Before we hung up, Vera asked, almost as an afterthought, whether I would come by and see her sometime soon. She said she missed my company and would very much like to meet the man I was marrying properly, over a meal she cooked herself rather than another stiff family dinner performed for an audience. I told her I would come soon, and meant it more sincerely than I had meant most family plans in recent memory. Talking to her had felt, for the first time in weeks, like talking to someone who wanted nothing from me except my company. No folder, no favor, no quiet expectation waiting underneath the warmth. I did not know. Sitting in my kitchen with the phone warm against my ear, what to do with that information yet. I only knew, the way you know a weather change before the sky has fully committed to it, that Vera had just handed me the first thread of something far larger than Dorothy's document or Derek's loan, something I would not fully understand for months, and that I would spend a great deal of that time wishing I had asked her more questions that very afternoon, while the thread was still new enough to be easy to follow. I hung up the phone and sat at my kitchen table for a long while, turning the conversation over the way I turn over a drawing that almost works, searching for the specific detail that would make the whole thing click into place. A paper mill sold too fast, for too little. A family that seemed to be living smaller, not larger, in the years since. My father's flat silence at the mention of business troubles. My mother's careful phrase about things being tighter lately than usual. None of it, on its own, amounted to proof of anything. All of it together felt, for the first time, like the outline of a shape I had been standing too close to my entire life to see clearly. The credit dispute resolved itself. Eventually, the way these things do when you have the right paperwork and enough patience to see the process through. Maya's letters worked. The bureaus reopened the investigation, and Derek's signed statement provided enough documentation to support the dispute. Within 6 weeks, the delinquency notation cleared from my report entirely. The account was transferred through a process Maya navigated, with a patience I could not have managed on my own, into a repayment plan that put the burden of the monthly payments squarely and formally on Derek. Greg approved our mortgage the following month. Sam and I stood in his office signing the final paperwork on the new shop building. And I remember the specific quiet satisfaction of watching my own signature go down on a document that finally, actually belonged only to the future I had chosen, no shadow account attached to it, no brother's unspoken need lurking behind the numbers. Greg shook both our hands afterward and told us, with the easy warmth of a man who genuinely enjoyed the better parts of his job, that this was his favorite kind of closing: two people building something real instead of refinancing their way out of a problem. I did not tell him how close we had come to never reaching that room at all. Some victories, I was learning, did not need an audience to feel complete. We toured the new building together the following weekend, empty except for dust and the ghost outlines of a previous tenant's shelving, and Sam walked the space slowly, narrating where each bay would go, where he planned to put a second workbench for the apprentice he wanted to formally hire once the lease was signed. I stood in the middle of the open floor, picturing the finished space the way I picture every building before it exists, and felt something settle in my chest that had nothing to do with relief, and everything to do with the plain, uncomplicated pleasure of watching a good plan finally have room to grow into itself. Derek made his first 3 payments on time. I want to give him that, because it would be easy, telling this story, to flatten him into nothing but the harm he caused, and the truth is more complicated than that, the way most people are more complicated than the worst thing they have done. He called me occasionally that summer, awkward, checking in. Once he brought over a small toolbox he had bought me as an apology gift. Useless and slightly absurd, given that Sam's shop held better tools than I would ever personally need, but touching in its own clumsy way, an actual attempt, however imperfect, to show up differently than he had before. I did not fully trust him again. Not the way I once had. Not the easy, uncomplicated trust of an older sister who assumes the best of a younger brother by default. I let something soften between us, cautiously. The kind of carefulness you give a bridge that's already failed once, but you aren't ready to abandon. What I could not soften, no matter how many weeks passed, was what had shifted between me and my parents. My mother called more frequently that summer, always with some small, pleasant reason, a recipe she wanted to share, a question about wedding colors. And I answered her the way you answer someone you love but no longer fully trust, warmly enough to keep the relationship intact, carefully enough to protect whatever I had left from being spent again without my knowledge. My father remained largely silent, present at the handful of family gatherings that summer, but rarely initiating conversation. I found myself watching him more closely than I ever had before, noticing small things I had spent 32 years training myself not to notice. The way his eyes moved to my mother before he answered almost any direct question. The particular tightness around his mouth whenever anyone mentioned Kingston Realty by name. By August, with wedding planning consuming most of my remaining attention, I told myself the worst of it was behind me. I had survived Dorothy's manipulation with my career and my relationship intact. I had survived Derek's betrayal with my finances. Eventually, restored. I had a fiance who loved me without conditions. A best friend who had fought for me without asking anything in return. A grandmother who had just handed me a thread I did not yet know how to follow. And a wedding. 6 months away. That felt, for the first time in a long while, like the actual center of my life, rather than something happening at the edges of my family's endless requirements. Sam and I spent one whole evening that August simply sitting in lawn chairs in the empty new building, a bottle of sparkling cider between us since neither of us felt much like real celebrating after everything the summer had cost. Talking about nothing more complicated than paint colors and where the front counter should sit. He asked me at some point whether I regretted any of it, the fight with Dorothy, the mess with Derek, whether I ever wished I had simply kept my head down the way I had for most of my 20s. I told him no, immediately, without needing to think about it. I told him I would rather know exactly what my family was capable of than spend one more year mistaking their silence for safety. He reached over and took my hand, sawdust still under his nails from the afternoon's work, and said that was, in his opinion, the exact difference between surviving a family and actually belonging to one, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life making sure I never had to settle for the first when I deserved the second. I did not know yet that the two smaller betrayals I had just survived were not separate incidents at all, but the outer edges of a single, much larger design, one that had been assembling itself quietly, patiently, for years, and that the people who loved me least in that family had simply been the first ones I happened to notice. I have thought a great deal, since that summer, about the specific arithmetic of family loyalty, the way my parents seemed to spend theirs on Derek's comfort, before they ever considered spending any of it on my protection. At the time, I told myself it was simply an old, familiar pattern, favoritism worn smooth by years of repetition. Nothing more sinister underneath it than the ordinary unfairness of families who love their children unevenly without meaning to. I did not yet understand that favoritism was not the actual shape of what I was looking at. What I was looking at, though I would not have the language for it until months later, was two parents quietly managing a much larger fear, one that had nothing to do with which child they loved more, and everything to do with which child they believed could survive what was coming, and which one they had already decided, without ever asking me, would have to carry it. That decision, I would come to learn, had a name, a document, and a page number. It arrived at my door disguised as an inheritance. My parents invited me to dinner in early September, 3 weeks before what would have been my 33rd birthday. The invitation arrived through my mother's usual channel, a warm, unremarkable text mentioning nothing beyond a family meal. Nothing to suggest the evening would end with a document I would spend the rest of my life measuring every other document against. I almost brought Sam. I am grateful, looking back, that something in me hesitated at the last minute and told him to stay home. That this felt like a conversation I needed to walk into alone. The same instinct that had told me to face Derek without an audience months earlier. My mother had cooked the way she always does for occasions she considers significant. The table was set with the good china again, the same set that had appeared at the dinner where she first met Sam. The china that always seemed to signal an evening where I was, in some fashion, being evaluated. My father sat at the head of the table, quieter than usual, even for him. And I noticed, the moment I walked in, a manila folder resting beside his plate, squared perfectly to the edge of the table in a way that reminded me, uncomfortably, of Dorothy's office months earlier. We made it through most of the meal on ordinary conversation, wedding logistics, a question about Bellhaven's downtown project, and I let myself relax slightly into the familiar rhythm of it, telling myself the folder was nothing. Paperwork my father had simply not gotten around to putting away. It was not nothing. My father cleared his throat once the plates had been cleared, the specific throat clear he uses when he has rehearsed something. He opened the folder. "There's something we need to discuss with you," he said, "about the trust and about your grandfather's wishes for the remaining estate." My mother reached over and rested her hand on top of his, a gesture that struck me, even before I understood why, as oddly formal, like two people presenting a united front rather than two parents having a comfortable conversation with their daughter. "Your grandfather always intended for the bulk of the estate to pass to you eventually," my father continued, "beyond what the trust has already distributed. There's a formal step required to finalize that. Something Whitlock drew up years ago as part of the original estate planning, meant to be executed once a beneficiary reached full maturity in the family's eyes. We've put it off longer than we should have, honestly. With your birthday coming, and the wedding, It felt like the right time to finally take care of it. He slid the folder across the table. A document, thicker and with more pages than I had expected, bore at the top, in plain, unadorned lettering, Kingston Family Contract. "It's mostly formality," my mother said quickly, before I had turned past the first page. "Language about family unity, continuity, honoring your grandfather's legacy. Whitlock can walk you through the specifics if you'd like. But honestly, sweetheart, at this point it's really just a matter of signing. We wanted to do this together, as a family, before your birthday. It felt important to us." I asked, reasonably, whether I could take the document home first, read it fully, perhaps have Maya look it over given her legal background, simply as due diligence on anything with my name and my grandfather's estate attached to it. Something flickered across my mother's face. Quick, controlled. The same particular flicker I had learned, months earlier. To recognize on Dorothy as the look of someone recalculating faster than they wanted to be seen recalculating. "Of course you can review it," she said. "Though I'll be honest, Laurel, it would mean a great deal to your father and me if you could sign it tonight, while we're all together. There's a window with the estate's tax filing, timing that matters more than I'd like it to, and Whitlock has assured us the language is entirely standard. We wouldn't ask if we didn't trust it completely ourselves." I sat there for a long moment, the document heavy in my hands, my father watching me with an expression I could not quite read. Underneath the room's warmth, I felt the same current I'd felt in Dorothy's office and that coffee shop with Derek. The pressure of people who'd already decided what my answer had to be. I signed it. I want to tell this part of the story exactly as it happened, without softening my own part in it. Since then, I've replayed every version of that evening where I said no, where I took the document home and read every page before my pen touched it. I know now, with the clarity that only comes after everything else has already happened. I signed my parents' contract the same way I'd signed Dorothy's form and Derek's loan papers, quickly and trustingly, in a room full of people who'd spent my life teaching me that questioning them was the same as betraying them. My father's hand shook slightly when he took the signed pages back. I remember noticing that and thinking nothing of it at the time, filing it away the same way I had filed away my mother's hesitation months earlier. One more small, strange detail I did not yet have the full picture to understand. My mother stood almost immediately after the signature dried, gathering the plates with a brisk, relieved energy that, in hindsight, felt like someone who'd just cleared a hurdle she'd been dreading for weeks. She brought out dessert, a pie she had clearly baked earlier that day, and steered the conversation firmly back toward the wedding, asking about flowers, as though the folder had never existed at all. My father said little for the rest of the evening. On my way out, he hugged me a beat longer than usual at the door, holding on in a way that already felt like an apology for something he hadn't yet found words to name. I drove home with the signed contract on the passenger seat, the same seat where, weeks later, it would sit again on the way to Denise's office. Though I did not know that yet, I only knew, pulling into my driveway, that I felt lighter than expected. Relieved in the plain way you feel after finally clearing paperwork that had been looming, unnamed, at the edge of a family relationship for months. I had no idea I had just signed away far more than a formality. I told Sam about the contract the next morning, over coffee at my kitchen table, sliding the signed pages across to him the same way. I realized only after the fact that my father had slid them to me the night before. He read through it slowly, more carefully than I had the night before, his brow furrowing at a few points. Twice he stopped himself from commenting, saying plainly that he was a carpenter, not a lawyer, and that he didn't want to alarm me over language he might simply be misreading. "I don't love how it reads," he said finally, sliding the pages back across the table. "I've signed enough contractor agreements to know legalese isn't automatically sinister. Half of it probably is standard estate language, like your mother said, but there's a section here, starting around page 15 or so, that shifts tone. It gets denser, more technical, the kind of dense that usually means someone wants you to skim past it instead of read it." I asked him what specifically about that section bothered him, and he admitted, honestly, that he could not name it precisely, only that the sentences got longer. The clauses started nesting inside each other. References to earlier definitions and later exhibits that made the whole section feel less like a description of a gift and more like the kind of scaffolding you build when you need something complicated to look simple from a distance. He said it reminded him, oddly, of a subcontractor agreement he had once nearly signed early in his career, before he knew better. One that buried a liability clause 4 pages deep in language so dense he had almost missed it entirely, and that the only thing that had saved him that time was a mentor who told him flatly that if a contract needed you tired and rushed to get through it, that was the contract asking you not to notice something. I asked him what he thought I should do. "Get it notarized independently," he said, "before you hand it back to anyone. Not because I think your parents are lying to you, necessarily. I just know, from every contract I've signed in 12 years running my own business, that the moment somebody rushes you toward a signature and away from a second set of eyes, that's exactly the moment you slow down and get a second set of eyes. Doesn't matter who's asking. Doesn't matter how much you love them." I sat with that advice for a long moment, recognizing the steady, unglamorous caution that made him a careful builder. He checked a measurement twice, not because he distrusted his hands, but because 12 years of experience had taught him a single unchecked assumption could cost far more than the minute it took to verify it. I called a notary public 2 days later, choosing one at random from a list of offices near Bellhaven rather than any office connected to my family, a small, unremarkable storefront I had driven past 100 times without ever once noticing its name. I made the appointment for a Tuesday afternoon. I told myself it was just a formality, a way to close the loop on paperwork that would need an official stamp eventually. But I wasn't admitting yet that some quiet, careful part of me had already started treating this document differently than I'd treated Dorothy's folder or Derek's loan paperwork. A wariness born of finally learning to check the fine print before trusting the people who handed things to me. I did not mention the appointment to my parents. I told myself there was no reason to, that a routine notarization did not require a family announcement. Driving to the office that Tuesday afternoon, I also understood that some part of me had simply stopped wanting to explain my precautions to people who had spent the last several months teaching me, one document at a time, exactly why those precautions had become necessary. Sam offered to come with me. I told him honestly I'd rather do this one alone too. The same instinct that had told me to face Derek without an audience. And I promised to call him the moment it was finished. He kissed me at the door that morning, told me it would probably turn out to be nothing, a lawyer's overcautious phrasing and nothing more, and added, almost as an afterthought, that he would be keeping his phone close all afternoon regardless. I did not think much of that promise at the time. I would be grateful for it within the hour. A woman named Denise greeted me, took the contract with the brisk efficiency of someone who processed dozens of documents a week without much variation between them, and began moving through the pages, fast, practiced, barely looking up. I sat in the small waiting chair across from her desk, my phone in my lap, half distracted by a work email I was drafting, expecting nothing more eventful than a stamp and a signature line and a drive back to the office in time for my 2 o'clock meeting. A dish of peppermint candy sat on the corner nearest me, half empty. The kind every notary office in America seems to keep stocked for exactly this sort of waiting, and I remember reaching for one, unwrapping it slowly, more out of habit than hunger, while Denise turned pages behind her desk in the same steady rhythm she must have used on hundreds of documents before mine. I checked the time twice, calculating whether I would make it back to Belhaven before my 2 o'clock and running through the agenda for that meeting in my head. A material substitution the contractor wanted approved on the downtown project. None of it required my full attention, but it didn't stop me from noticing, eventually, that the rhythm of Denise's page-turning had changed. Then, on page 17, she stopped. Denise did not pause the way people pause when they lose their place on a page. She stopped the way you do when your body understands something a half-second before your mind has finished processing it. She froze mid-motion, her pen still raised an inch above the signature block she had been about to notarize. She read the paragraph once, her eyes moving slowly across it, her lips barely shaping the words the way people's lips move when they are reading something dense enough to require the extra effort. Then she went back to the top of the page and read it again. I watched her repeat that same slow pass a third time. Somewhere in it her posture changed and straightened. The loose, practiced efficiency she'd carried through the first 16 pages replaced by something careful, deliberate, almost wary. I had been half distracted until that moment, still composing the work email in my head, still calculating whether I would make my 2 o'clock. The change in her posture pulled my attention fully onto her for the first time since I had sat down, and I felt, before I understood why, the specific instinct architects develop for structural problems. The sense that something load-bearing had just been quietly identified as compromised. "I'm sorry," she said, setting the pen down on the desk, not on the page. "I need to stop here." I asked her what was wrong, my pulse already climbing, some instinct in my body responding to the shift in her expression before I had consciously registered what it meant. "I can't notarize this document," she said. "Not this page. I'm not going to tell you it's nothing, because it isn't nothing. And I'm also not going to tell you exactly what it says, because that's not my place, legally or otherwise. What I can tell you is that a notary's job is to verify identity and witness a voluntary signature, not to evaluate the content of what someone's signing. I take that second part seriously, even when it's uncomfortable. This is one of those uncomfortable moments. I told her I had already signed it, days earlier, at my parents' house, and asked whether that changed anything. Something crossed her face at that, quick, and I could not tell if it was sympathy or alarm, or some combination of both that she had learned, over years of this work, to keep off her features as much as possible. "It might," she said carefully. "I'm honestly not qualified to tell you what it means for an already executed document. What I am telling you, as clearly as I know how, is that you need your own attorney to look at this. Today, if you can manage it. Not the attorney who drafted it. Your own." "Who drafted it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer, could already feel the shape of it settling into place even before she answered. "There's a name on the drafting attorney line," Denise said. "I'm not going to read it out loud because I don't think it's my place to editorialize on a family's legal representation, but I'd encourage you to look at page 1 again yourself, closely, before you leave." I flipped back with hands that had gone, without my permission, unsteady. Arthur Whitlock's name sat exactly where I somehow already knew it would, printed in the same formal block lettering that had appeared on every document my family had ever handed me. It belonged to the tall, silver-haired man who had watched me from across a crowded living room months earlier, and his expression was, with total sickening clarity, exactly what I had originally suspected: concern, regret. The look of a man who knew something he was bound not to say. I asked Denise weakly whether she saw documents like this often, whether there was any chance she was simply being overly cautious about ordinary legal language she had misread, She was kind about it, gentler than her earlier caution had suggested she might be. "I've notarized thousands of documents," she said. "I know the difference between dense and dangerous. I could be wrong about which one this is. I don't think I am, and I'm not willing to put my stamp on it while there's any real chance I'm right." I thanked her, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, distant, like it belonged to someone speaking from another room. I gathered the unnotarized pages, my hands shaking now in a way I made no effort to hide. I walked out to my car without fully registering the short distance between her desk and the parking lot, past the peppermint candy dish, past a receptionist who wished me a good afternoon without knowing anything of what had just happened 6 feet away from her desk. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment before I could make myself call anyone. My hands are always steady. It is the one part of my body I have trained never to shake, no matter what it is carrying. Not in a hospital waiting room, not on a job site walk through with a nervous client, not in 18 years of Dorothy's careful pressure. They were shaking so badly I put the contract on the passenger seat to stop staring at my own fingers. In that strange, detached clarity that hits in the middle of a crisis, I realized I'd spent my career trusting documents the way other people trust bridges, assuming the calculations under them were honest. I had just watched a stranger's face tell me, without a word, that mine had not been. I called Maya first, then Sam. My voice breaking somewhere in the middle of the first sentence, I managed to say to each of them, Maya told me to bring her the full document that evening, every page, and nothing else. Not my parents' explanations, not my own guesses about what it might mean. Just the paper itself and whatever time it took to read it properly. Sam said almost nothing beyond asking if I was safe to drive. When I told him I was, he said he'd meet me at Maya's office instead of waiting at home. He didn't want either of us to be alone with this for one more hour than necessary, whatever page 17 contained. I understood, sitting there in that parking lot with the engine still off and the afternoon light slanting flat across the dashboard. That it was not a formality. The two people who had handed it to me across their good china, 3 weeks before my birthday, had known exactly what they were asking me to sign the entire time. Maya's office after hours felt different than it had the day we sorted through Derek's paperwork. It was quieter. The overhead lights turned low, with only her desk lamp and the glow of her laptop screen throwing long shadows across a conference table that had, months earlier, held a much smaller crisis than the one now spread across it. Sam arrived a few minutes after I did, still in his work clothes, sawdust on his forearms, having clearly left the shop mid-task the moment I called him. He sat beside me without saying much, his hand resting flat against my back, while Maya read through the contract in near total silence, page after page. She occasionally made a small mark in the margin with a pencil and stopped to reread a paragraph the way Denise had hours earlier. I watched her turn each page with the specific, unhurried thoroughness she brought to every contract she had ever reviewed for me, refusing, even now, even with my hand still faintly trembling beside her, to let urgency push her past a single clause she had not fully understood. I had brought a copy of everything, the full document, the notary's unsigned acknowledgement page, even the scrap of notes I had scribbled in the parking lot outside Denise's office while I waited for my hands to steady enough to drive. Maya had asked for all of it without exception, telling me over the phone that half of understanding a bad contract was understanding exactly how it had been delivered, not just what it said. It took her nearly 40 minutes to reach page 17. I watched her face the whole time, the way I imagined Denise had watched mine, looking for the exact moment her expression would change. It changed. "Okay," Maya said quietly, setting the pencil down. "I need you to understand something before I explain what this says, and I need you to hear the caveat first, because I am not your family's estate attorney, and I don't have full visibility into everything this connects to. But based on what's in front of me, and based on the language I've seen in agreements like this before, professionally, this section is not describing an inheritance. This isn't an inheritance. It's an assumption of debt, I asked her, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. What that meant in plain terms. In plain terms, Maya said, choosing her words with the same care she had used months earlier warning me about Derek. This section obligates you, personally, as an individual, to assume financial responsibility for certain existing liabilities, described here only by reference to attached schedules that aren't included in what you brought me tonight. There's language about joint and several liability. There's language releasing certain other parties, unnamed here directly, but presumably your parents, from primary responsibility once you sign. It's structured to read like a condition of receiving the estate. Functionally, it reads like you inheriting somebody else's debt, dressed up in inheritance language so it would feel like a gift instead of what it actually is. Sam's hand went still against my back. I felt the whole room go quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the actual sound in it. How much debt? I asked, though some part of me did not want the answer. Are we talking about... I don't know, Maya said. The schedules aren't attached. That's actually one of the more concerning details. Honestly, from a drafting perspective, a properly executed assumption agreement would typically attach the specific obligations being assumed clearly, so both parties understand exactly what's changing hands. This document references schedules by number, plural, and none of them are here, which means either your parents' attorney made a significant drafting oversight, or someone intended for you to sign this without ever seeing the actual number you were agreeing to take on. I thought about my father's shaking hands, about my mother's rehearsed urgency, about the tax filing deadline she had invoked to rush me toward a signature before I had time to think. None of it, in that moment, felt like an oversight. Maya reached across the table and took my hand. The same gesture she had used the day I first told her about Dorothy. Steady, grounding, the specific comfort of someone who had spent 12 years proving, over and over, that she would show up for me without ever once requiring anything in return. We're going to figure out exactly what this is, she said. Tonight, we start with the schedules. Tomorrow, we find out where the actual number lives. But Laurel, I need you to hear me clearly. Whatever this turns out to be, it did not happen because you were careless. It happened because two people who were supposed to protect you built something specifically designed to be signed quickly by someone who trusted them completely. That's not a flaw in you. That's a flaw, a very deliberate one, in them. She spent the next hour walking us through the document line by line, translating the denser passages into language Sam and I could actually follow. And by the time we finally left her office, well past 10, she had a short list of next steps written out on a legal pad request, the missing schedules formally, in writing, from the drafting attorney of record. Pull whatever public records existed on Kingston Realty's financial standing, and, gently, carefully, find a way to ask my grandmother what else she remembered about the years surrounding that paper mill sale. Sam drove me home that night. My car left overnight in Maya's parking garage, both of us too rattled to trust my own reflexes on the road. He did not try to fill the silence with reassurance he could not honestly offer. He simply held my hand over the console the entire drive, occasionally glancing over to check that I was still breathing steadily. When we finally reached my driveway, he told me quietly that whatever this turned out to be, I would not be facing it the way I had faced every other family reckoning in my life. I would not have to perform composure for people who had never once earned it. I drove to Vera's house 2 days later, alone, the same way I had driven to Denise's office, some instinct in me insisting that certain conversations in this story needed to happen without an audience. even a loving one. She met me at the door already knowing something was wrong. She had the specific, unerring instinct of a woman who had spent 31 years reading 9-year-olds' faces for the truth beneath whatever they were telling her. And she led me into the kitchen without asking questions, setting a kettle on the stove the way she had at every difficult moment of my childhood. Tea before talking, always, as though the ritual itself bought enough calm to make the conversation survivable. Sitting at her small table, I noticed the same sewing basket she'd kept on the sideboard my whole life, and beside it a shoebox of old photographs she'd clearly been sorting through. Harold looked out from several of them, younger than I'd ever known him, standing in front of buildings that no longer existed in the town I grew up visiting. "You've been thinking about him a lot," I said, nodding toward the photographs, grateful for a moment to delay whatever conversation had actually brought me there. "I think about him every day," Vera said simply. "But yes, more than usual lately. I suppose some part of me has been trying to remember exactly who he was, and what he actually wanted for this family, before I let myself believe the version other people have been telling me instead." I told her everything: the contract, page 17, Denise's refusal, Maya's translation of the language into something closer to its real meaning. I watched her face while I spoke, and I saw something I had never seen on her before. It was not surprise exactly, but a grim, weary confirmation. The look of a woman finally hearing a shape she had suspected for years spoken out loud by someone else. "I need you to tell me everything you remember about the paper mill," I said, once I had finished. "Not the vague feeling you told me about on the phone. Everything, dates, if you have them. Anything your father-in-law's papers might have shown you. Anything Dad might have let slip." Vera was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around her own teacup, though she had not yet taken a sip. "Your grandfather bought that mill in 1981. She said finally. "A friend from his army days ran it and needed a partner to keep it solvent through a rough patch. Harold, being Harold, couldn't say no when an old friend asked for help. It never made the family serious money like the shopping centers did. It still provided jobs for a couple hundred people in a county that did not have many to spare. Provided jobs for a couple hundred people in a county that didn't have many to spare. Your father sold it about 6 years ago," she continued. "I remember because it was the same spring Kingston Realty broke ground on that mixed development out past the interstate. The big one your father talked about constantly for a year. Oddly, he almost entirely stopped mentioning it once it was finished. I asked him about the mill sale directly, at the time. He told me the industry had changed. Digital everything, less demand for paper than there used to be. That it made sense to consolidate the estate into fewer, stronger holdings. It sounded reasonable enough. I didn't think much more of it, not then." "What changed?" I asked. "That development," Vera said. "The one he was so proud of. The one that was supposed to be the biggest thing Kingston Realty had ever built. It never fully leased up. I heard bits and pieces over the years. From people in town who worked in commercial real estate. Nothing official, just talk. It sat half empty for years and was refinanced at least once, as far as I know. And your father, meanwhile, kept talking less and less about the business at every family gathering, the way a man does when the thing he's proudest of has quietly become the thing he least wants anyone asking about." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling pieces I had been carrying separately, unconnected, for months finally starting to arrange themselves into something with an actual shape. The mill sold too fast, too cheap. A development that never worked the way it was supposed to. My father's silence at every mention of the business. My mother's careful phrase about money being tighter lately than usual. Derek asking our parents for help and being told, unusually, no. I thought about the folder my father had slid across the dinner table, squared perfectly at the edges, the way Dorothy always squared her own paperwork before using it, and understood, with a sick, sliding clarity, that I might be looking at the actual reason behind every strange, small detail that had accumulated across this entire year. Not one family's ordinary dysfunction, scattered and unrelated, a single coherent motive, hiding in plain sight behind three separate people's separate reasons for needing something from me. "Vera," I said, "do you think they're in trouble? Real trouble, not just an uncomfortable year." She reached across the table and took my hand. The same steady, grounding gesture Maya had offered 2 nights earlier. 2 women from entirely different corners of my life, arriving independently at the same instinct to hold on to me while I absorbed something heavy. "I think," she said carefully, "that your father has spent his whole life terrified of being the generation that lost what his father built. And I think a man that afraid, faced with actually losing it, might convince himself that almost anything is justified. If it means the failure never has to become public, never has to become real. I don't know exactly what they've done, Laurel, but I know fear like that doesn't stay contained. It reaches for whatever's closest and strongest enough to hold the weight. And you, my darling girl, have always been the strongest one in that family, by a wide margin, whether or not anyone ever bothered to tell you so." Maya called me on a Wednesday evening with the specific, controlled energy of a lawyer who had found exactly what she was looking for and was trying not to let her own certainty outrun the facts. "I want to walk you through this slowly," she said, "because there's a lot here, and I don't want you absorbing it faster than you can actually process it. Can you talk right now, or do you want Sam there first?" I told her Sam was already home, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. I put the call on speaker so we could both hear her at once. "County property records confirm the paper mill sale," Maya began. "Sold 6 years ago, well below the assessed value of the land alone, to a buyer that turns out to be a shell company registered to an address that traces back to one of Robert's former business associates. That's not necessarily illegal on its own. People sell to related parties for all kinds of legitimate reasons. But combined with everything else, it's a significant flag. The bigger piece," she continued, "is the development your grandmother mentioned. Kingston Realty broke ground on it the same year the mill sold. A mixed retail and residential project financed through a commercial construction loan with a regional bank. Public filings show it never reached full occupancy, not even close, and Kingston Realty refinanced that loan twice over the following 4 years, each time at less favorable terms, which usually signals a lender getting nervous about the underlying collateral. Sam's hand found mine under the table. "There's a lien," Maya said, more quietly now. "A significant one, filed against Kingston Realty's remaining commercial holdings 18 months ago, held by the same bank that financed the development. I can't see the exact outstanding balance from public records alone. Liens don't always disclose that level of detail, but the filing language suggests the company is behind on payments and has been for some time. Combined with what you already know from the contract itself, the assumption of debt language, and the missing schedules, I think it's reasonable to conclude your parents are dealing with a debt significantly larger than anything they've admitted. They haven't been willing to say it out loud to you, to Derek, possibly even to each other." I sat with the phone between us for a long moment. It felt less like a revelation and more like a diagnosis, confirming a symptom I'd been circling for weeks. "The inheritance," I said slowly. "There isn't one, is there? Not really." "I can't say that with total certainty from where I'm sitting," Maya said carefully. There could still be assets I haven't found yet, things structured in ways that don't show up in the searches I've run. But based on everything in front of me, I think the honest answer is that whatever's left of your grandfather's estate has likely been used, over the past several years, to keep Kingston Realty and your parents personally afloat. And I think the contract they had you sign wasn't designed to give you a share of something that still exists. I think it was designed to make you legally responsible for a debt that already exists, using language dressed up to feel like the opposite. Sam asked, his voice tight with a controlled anger I had heard from him only once before. Why anyone would draft something like that specifically targeting their own daughter instead of simply asking for help honestly? Because asking honestly requires admitting the failure, Maya said. And I think, based on everything Laurel's described about this family, admitting failure was never actually on the table. Managing appearances was always the priority. This contract lets your parents solve their real problem without ever having to say the word bankruptcy out loud to anyone, including, possibly, themselves. I thought about my father's shaking hands. I thought about my mother's rehearsed urgency. The tax filing deadline they'd waved at me had never existed as anything but pressure. I thought about 18 years of being taught, by every adult in that family except the one currently sitting in a small house on the edge of Concord, with a shoebox of old photographs. That love and obligation were the same word. They were spelled differently depending on who needed something from whom. I need to see Whitlock, I said. Not my parents. Him, directly. I want him in a room, and I want them in that room too. And I want every schedule this contract was supposed to include sitting on the table in front of all of us. Maya was quiet for a moment. I can arrange that, she said. But Laurel, I need you to be ready for what happens once you do. Once this is out in the open, formally, in front of the family's own attorney, there's no putting it back. I told her I understood. I had understood, if I am honest. For weeks, ever since a stranger with a peppermint candy dish had stopped reading halfway down a page, and looked at me like she had just seen something she could not unsee. I was simply the last one, apparently, to catch up to what everyone around me had already started quietly protecting me from, or failing to, after we hung up. Sam and I sat at the table for a long time without speaking. The phone sat dark between us. The kitchen quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and, somewhere outside, a neighbor's dog barking at nothing. I thought about every dinner at that dining table with the good china, every family evening where Dorothy invoked the trust like scripture. Every small, strange detail I had filed away over the past year suddenly made sense as part of the same file. I understood now. They belonged to one file. They had always belonged to one file. I had simply never been shown the folder itself. I was handed individual pages one at a time, each disguised as something separate from the others. Sam finally spoke, quietly, asking whether I wanted to tell my grandmother what we had found before the meeting with Whitlock, or whether I wanted to spare her a little longer. I told him I would tell her myself in person, before anyone else heard it from me. She had trusted me with the first thread months ago, and I wasn't going to let her learn the rest secondhand, the way I had spent most of my life learning things about this family. I went to my parents' house alone the following evening, before the formal meeting Maya was arranging with Whitlock. Some part of me still needed to give them a chance to tell me the truth themselves, without a lawyer in the room or documents laid out like evidence. A last opportunity to be the parents I'd spent 32 years hoping they were underneath everything else. My mother answered the door, already wary. Some instinct in her reading, correctly, that this was not a social visit. My father was in the living room when I walked in, and he stood the moment he saw my face. His expression collapsed into something I had genuinely never seen on him before. Not embarrassment, not defensiveness, something closer to relief. The relief of a man who had been carrying a weight so long that even its discovery felt, in the first instant, like being allowed to finally put part of it down. I did not sit. I told them, plainly, without raising my voice, what Maya had found. The mill, the shell company, the development that never leased up, the lien, the missing schedules on a contract that had nothing to do with inheritance and everything to do with a debt they had never once had the courage to name directly to my face. My mother spoke first, the way she always speaks first, already reaching for the version of this story that could still be managed. "You're twisting this into something uglier than it is," she said. "Your father and I have made difficult decisions. Yes, decisions we're not proud of, but everything we've done, every single thing, has been to protect this family, to keep what your grandfather built from disappearing entirely. We didn't ask you to sign something we didn't believe you could handle." "You didn't ask me anything," I said. "You handed me a folder across good china and told me it was mostly formality. You used a tax deadline that didn't exist to rush me past reading it. You had your own lawyer draft a document specifically designed to make me legally responsible for a debt you never once described to me honestly. That's not protecting the family. Mom, that's using me." My father spoke then, quietly. The first real sentence he had offered since I walked in. "The bank was going to take everything," he said. "Not just the development. Everything. Your grandfather's shopping centers, the last of the trust's real holdings, all of it. Cross-collateralized years ago in ways I don't fully understand myself, honestly, because I let people smarter than me structure it and never asked enough questions until it was already too late to unwind. Whitlock came to us 18 months ago and told us there was one option left that didn't end in total loss. Your credit, your income, strong enough to refinance the obligation into something the bank would actually accept." "You could have told me that," I said, my voice breaking despite every effort to keep it steady. "You could have sat me down and said, we are in serious trouble, and we need help, and we don't know how to ask for it without losing everything we've told ourselves about who we are. I would have helped you figure out a real plan. Dad, I do this professionally. I understand debt structures and financing better than almost anyone you know. Instead, you decided, without asking, that the version of me you needed was a signature, not a daughter." My mother's composure finally cracked. It didn't become an apology. It was closer to defensive grief. "Every choice I made to keep this family standing," she said, her voice rising for the first time. "You don't understand what it's like, watching everything your husband's father built come apart because of decisions your husband made, and having to decide every single day whether telling the truth is worth losing all of it. I was trying to save us. Laurel. All of us, you included." I looked at both of them for a long moment, my father unable to meet my eyes, my mother's hands trembling slightly around a sentence she clearly believed completely. "I need to see Whitlock," I said. "All of us, together, with the actual schedules this time, the real numbers, everything the contract was supposed to include and somehow didn't. I'm not signing anything else in this house, ever again, without seeing the full truth first. You've had 18 months to find another way. I'm giving you exactly one more chance to be honest with me, in front of someone whose job requires it." Neither of them argued, I think, looking back. Some part of both of them had been waiting, almost as long as I had, for this exact conversation to finally happen out loud. Before I left, I asked my father whether Derek knew any of this. I asked if the loan he had pushed onto me months earlier had anything to do with the same underlying trouble. My father said no, quietly. He said Derek's situation had been separate, a genuinely selfish, smaller mistake that had simply happened to land in the same difficult year. I did not know whether to believe him. Not fully. not anymore. Something in the specific, tired way he said it convinced me at least that he wasn't currently capable of the kind of coordinated dishonesty it would have taken to fabricate that particular detail on the spot. My mother walked me to the door, her composure mostly rebuilt by then. She said quietly that she hoped I understood none of this changed how much she loved me. I told her, as gently as I still had the capacity to manage, that love without honesty was not actually love. It was just a nicer word for management, and I had spent 32 years mistaking one for the other because nobody in this family had ever shown me the difference. She did not have an answer for that. I am not sure, even now, that she has found one since. I drove home that night past the same streets I had driven 1,000 times before, past the same church my mother still ran her fundraisers out of, past the same trust office where Dorothy had first slid a folder across a desk toward me almost a year earlier. I felt the strange, disorienting sensation of watching an entire familiar landscape reveal itself, all at once, as something I had never actually understood the true shape of. Arthur Whitlock's office occupied the top floor of a building on Charlotte's main legal corridor. It was all dark wood and diplomas, the kind of space built to make everyone who enters feel slightly smaller than whoever sits behind the desk. He did not sit behind the desk when I arrived. He stood by the window. When I walked in with Maya beside me and my parents arrived a few minutes later, not quite looking at each other, something passed across his face that I recognized immediately. It was the same expression I had caught once before across a crowded living room, watching me without quite watching me, concern, regret, a man finally about to say the thing he had spent months, possibly years, being professionally forbidden from saying. Maya opened by requesting, formally, the complete schedules referenced in the contract, along with a full accounting of Kingston Realty's current liabilities and the specific amount my parents intended for me to assume under the agreement I had signed. Whitlock did not resist the request. He seemed, if anything, almost relieved to finally be asked directly. He slid a much thicker folder across his desk, one that made the folder my father had brought to dinner look, in hindsight, like the smallest opening move in a much larger game. The number, when it finally appeared in front of me in black and white, was larger than I had let myself imagine even in my worst calculations of the past week. I will not recite it here in full. I will only say it was the kind of number that changes the shape of a room, the kind that makes grown adults go quiet in ways no amount of family loyalty had managed to make them go quiet before. "I want to be honest with you, Laurel," Whitlock said, and there was something in his voice I had never heard from him before. Tired, worn thin by a burden he had clearly been carrying alone for longer than 18 months. "I drafted this contract because your parents instructed me to, and because, professionally, that instruction fell within the bounds of what I'm legally permitted to do. I want you to know I raised concerns, more than once, about the structure of it, about whether it was fair to present this to you without full transparency about what it actually asked of you. I was told each time that the family would handle the framing themselves, that it wasn't my place to interfere with how a parent chooses to speak to their own child." "You could have told me anyway," I said. "You watched me across a room months ago like you already knew what this was going to cost me." "I could have," Whitlock said. "I chose not to, because I convinced myself it wasn't my place, and because, I'll admit, some part of me hoped your parents would find the courage to tell you themselves before it ever reached this point. That was a professional failure on my part, dressed up as respect for a client relationship. I've represented this family for 30 years. I let that history cloud a judgment I should have made more plainly a long time ago." I turned to my parents, both of them silent, my mother's hands folded tightly in her lap, my father staring at a spot on the carpet somewhere between his shoes and the desk. "You told Dorothy something too," I said, remembering suddenly the porch, the vague warning. There are people in this family. She knew there was pressure coming from somewhere. She just didn't know the shape of it either, did she? She was protecting her own position in this the only way she knew how, guessing at a threat none of you ever fully explained to her. Nobody answered that directly, which was, I understood by then, its own kind of answer. Whitlock cleared his throat and added one more detail. He said he felt obligated to disclose now that the larger truth was already on the table. Your aunt was instructed, specifically, on how to phrase the authorization she had you sign at the trust office, he said. The language about you not needing to understand the clause, simply needing to sign it, came from a conversation she had with your parents, not from her own judgment alone. This was never one relative acting alone. It was a pattern, coordinated loosely across more than one member of this family. And I regret that my own signature sits at the bottom of the document that made the last piece of it possible. I felt something in my chest go very still, hearing that. I had spent months treating Dorothy's manipulation and my parents' contract as separate wounds, connected only by last name. They had never been separate. The same practiced phrasing and the same insistence that understanding was not required, only compliance, had simply moved from one relative's mouth to another's, refined each time. It finally arrived across my parents' good china in its most convincing costume yet. I reached into my bag and pulled out the contract, the same pages that had sat unnotarized on my passenger seat for weeks. I set them on Whitlock's desk in front of all three of them. I'm not signing the schedules, I said. I'm not assuming this debt. I'm not going to spend the next 20 years of my life paying for decisions I was never allowed to be part of. They were made by people who decided, again and again, that managing an image mattered more than telling me the truth. Dorothy tried to control who I loved and what I did for a living. Derek spent my name without asking. But you two are my parents. You were supposed to be the last line, the people who protected me from exactly this kind of harm, not the ones who authored it. I picked up the contract and tore it once, straight down the center. The sound was unexpectedly loud in that quiet, expensive room as I set both halves back down on Whitlock's desk. I'm done, I said. Not just with this contract, with all of it. I need you both to understand that I mean that completely. My mother started to speak, a fragment about keeping the family standing, and I held up a hand, not unkindly. It had a finality I had never once, in 32 years, allowed myself to use with either of them. I know why you did it, I said. Vera helped me understand that part. Fear does strange things to people who are terrified of becoming the generation that lost everything. I even believe, some of it, that you convinced yourselves this was love. But I am not available to be your solution anymore. I'm your daughter. I was always supposed to be your daughter first. And you made me something else instead. Without ever once asking whether I was willing to become it. I stood and gathered nothing. Since there was nothing left in that room that belonged to me anymore. I walked past Whitlock's assistant, past the elevator bank, down through the lobby and out into a Charlotte afternoon that felt, for the first time in nearly a year, entirely, uncomplicatedly my own. Sam was waiting outside, exactly where he had told me he would be. Leaning against his truck in the parking lot 2 blocks from Whitlock's building. He had driven over the moment Maya texted him that the meeting had started. He did not ask me anything right away. He simply opened his arms, and I walked into them. Standing on a Charlotte sidewalk in the flat gray light of a late September afternoon, not crying yet, just breathing. It was the particular breathing of someone who had set down something so heavy years ago that she had stopped noticing its weight, and was only now discovering how light the rest of her body felt underneath it. How was it? He asked finally, quietly, into my hair. "I tore it," I said. In front of their lawyer, I tore the whole thing in half and told them I was done. He pulled back enough to look at my face, checking the way he always checks, for signs of what I actually needed in that moment, rather than what I might feel obligated to perform. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. He did not tell me I had done the right thing, did not offer reassurance I had not asked for. He simply said, "Okay," and held me a while longer, and then asked if I wanted to drive or if I wanted him to. I let him drive. I sat in the passenger seat of his truck, watching Charlotte move past the window, the same skyline I had watched turn gold and gray on so many drives home over the past year, and felt something I had not expected to feel yet. Not relief exactly, something closer to a held breath finally releasing. The specific ache of a body that has been braced for impact for so long it does not immediately know how to stand down. I did not cry until we were almost home, somewhere on the last stretch of road before my street. And when it came all at once, the whole year of it. Dorothy's folder and Derek's paperwork and my father's shaking hands and my mother's rehearsed urgency and a stranger's peppermint candy dish and a number too large to say out loud. All of it arriving together in the front seat of Sam's truck, while he drove with one hand and held mine with the other, saying nothing, letting me have exactly as much of it as I needed without once trying to fix what could not, that evening, be fixed. We did not talk about the wedding that night, or the future, or anything requiring more than the two of us existing quietly in the same space. Sam made dinner, simple, nothing that required either of us to perform normalcy for anyone. And we ate on the couch instead of at the table, the specific small rebellion of two people who had both, in their own ways, spent that year learning what it cost to sit at tables built for other people's approval. Maya called around 8, checking in, and I put her on speaker while Sam cleared the plates. She told me Whitlock had reached out to her directly after we left, formally confirming, in writing, that he considered the assumption of debt clause withdrawn given my refusal to execute the schedules, and that he had advised my parents, separately, to seek their own independent counsel going forward. Since continuing to represent a family now openly divided over the matter created an obvious conflict he was no longer comfortable managing, I asked her what that meant for me. Practically, she said it meant, as far as she could tell, that the matter was closed, legally, on my end, cleanly, without a single signature of mine attached to anything but the original administrative form Dorothy had slipped past me almost a year earlier. A form Maya was already drafting a formal revocation for, just to be thorough. I thanked her, the way I had thanked her a dozen times that year, and she told me, gently, before hanging up, that she was proud of me, not for tearing the contract, though she understood why that mattered, but for asking the right questions early enough to still have options left by the time the truth finally arrived, somewhere around 10. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother, 3 lines long, none of them an apology, all of them some version of the same plea she had offered in Whitlock's office, that every choice she made had been to keep the family standing. "Please call me when you're ready to talk." I read it once and set the phone face down on the coffee table, and did not answer it that night, or the next one, or for a long while after that. I understood, sitting on that couch with Sam's arm around my shoulders. The television on low for background noise neither of us was actually watching, that I had just done the hardest, cleanest thing I had ever done in my adult life, and that it was not going to feel like victory for a while yet. Some doors do not close with triumph. Some close simply because you have finally understood, completely and without room for argument, that keeping them open was costing you more than closing them ever could. Sam sat back down beside me once the call ended, and asked, carefully, how I felt about Dorothy, whether tonight's revelation about her, that she had simply been repeating language handed to her by my parents, changed anything about where I stood with her. I told him I did not know yet. Dorothy's cruelty still felt like her own choice, even if someone else had written the first draft of it. But I understood her a little differently now. Less like the architect of my worst year and more like one more person my parents had used in their own careful, fearful way, without ever fully telling her what she was actually protecting. I fell asleep before 11 that night, earlier than I had slept in months. I did not dream about contracts, folders, good china, or a stranger's peppermint candy dish. I dreamed, for the first time in almost a year, about nothing in particular at all. I woke the next morning feeling, for the first time in even longer, like a woman who finally belonged entirely to herself. Sam and I got married the following spring, exactly on schedule, at the small farm outside Charlotte we had chosen together. 60 guests, no good china, no folder waiting on any table for anyone to sign. My mother was not there. Neither was my father. I sent them an invitation, in the end, because some part of me still believed in giving people one more chance than they had earned. Neither of them responded, and I have made a kind of uneasy peace with the fact that some doors, once you have finally closed them properly, do not reopen simply because enough time has passed to make everyone comfortable again. Vera walked me down the aisle. She insisted on it the moment I asked, saying she had been waiting her whole life for a Kingston wedding that felt like an actual celebration instead of a performance. She stood beside me for the entire ceremony in a pale blue dress, she told me, laughing. She had bought for the occasion the week I got engaged, certain long before either of us knew how the story would actually unfold that this day would eventually arrive. She moved into a small cottage near our new house that following fall, close enough that she comes for dinner most Sundays. She was there the afternoon Sam finally finished the second bay at Reyes Woodworks and hung a small brass plaque by the door that read simply, Est, 12 years ago, built to last. Derek stood up for me too, in his own quiet way, present at the wedding, sober and steady, still working through the last of his repayment plan with a discipline that surprised both of us. Our relationship has not gone back to what it was before that coffee shop, and I do not think it ever fully will. Some trust, once spent carelessly, does not refund itself completely no matter how many honest payments follow it. But he calls now, regularly. Actual calls, instead of favors disguised as calls. Last month he told me awkwardly that he had started seeing someone who worked at the credit union near his apartment, someone who apparently had opinions about interest rates that made him laugh, and that he thought for the first time in a long time he might actually be building something real instead of borrowing his way through another year. Maya was my maid of honor. She gave a toast at the reception that made half the room laugh and the other half cry, mostly about the specific, unglamorous work of choosing your own family when the one you were born into fails to show up for you. And I watched Sam's mother, who had flown in from Gastonia for the occasion, nod along like she understood exactly what Maya meant, because she probably did in her own way, having raised a son who had never once needed a folder to prove he belonged to anyone. I never heard from Dorothy again after that meeting in Whitlock's office. I understand, through Vera, secondhand, that she stepped back from her role at the trust not long after, citing health reasons that nobody in the family has ever fully confirmed or denied. I do not know what she truly understood, in the end, about the role she had played, whether she felt used or simply inconvenienced by the collapse of an arrangement that had, for 18 years, given her more power than her actual relationship to any of us had ever earned her. I have decided, mostly, to let that question go unanswered. Some doors close on their own, without needing a final conversation to seal them shut. My father sent one letter, the following winter, 3 lines in his own handwriting. The same careful hand I remembered from childhood report cards he used to sign. He wrote that he understood why I had done what I did, that he did not blame me, and that he hoped, someday, when I was ready, we might find a way back to something. Though he did not specify what that something would look like, and I suspect, honestly, that he did not know himself. I kept the letter. I have not answered it yet. I am allowing myself the specific luxury my family never once allowed me, the right to take exactly as long as I need, on my own terms, before deciding what I owe anyone in return for their regret. Kingston Realty, I have heard, is being sold off in pieces. The remaining commercial holdings liquidated to satisfy the debt Whitlock's schedules finally made visible. My grandfather's shopping centers, the ones I remember from childhood field trips as a girl too young to understand what they represented, now belong to other people's spreadsheets, other people's ambitions. I feel, when I let myself think about it at all, something closer to grief than triumph. The specific, complicated grief of watching an inheritance disappear that was never actually mine to lose, taken not by circumstance but by the very people who were supposed to be its stewards. What I built instead, in the wreckage of all of it, feels sturdier than anything a trust document could have handed me. A marriage that asks nothing of me except honesty. A grandmother who chose me deliberately in every way that mattered, long before any document required her to. A best friend who spent a year of her own time and expertise protecting me and never once presented a bill for it. A brother, imperfect and still learning, who is at least, finally, trying to build something real instead of borrowing against someone else's trust to fake it. Bellhaven made me partner that same year, the promotion arriving quietly, almost anticlimactically. A single conversation with Elaine over coffee that took less time than any single meeting I had ever survived at my parents' dining table. I finished the downtown project not long after, the courtyard exactly as I had sketched it that first restless spring. And I still walk through it sometimes on my lunch break, watching strangers sit on benches I designed, entirely unaware of everything that was happening in my own life, while I drew the lines that would eventually hold them up. There is a particular satisfaction in that anonymity, in building something solid for people who will never know your name, that I have come to treasure more than I ever expected to. I think about page 17 often, more than I probably should. It is not the debt itself, which Maya assures me I am fully legally free of. I think about the specific mechanism of it, the way an entire family's fear had been folded into language dense enough to survive a quick reading, patient enough to wait for exactly the right tired, trusting, distracted moment to be signed. I think about how close I came to simply handing it back across that dinner table without a second glance, the way I had handed back 100 smaller documents before it, and I understand now that the difference between that outcome and this one was never courage exactly. A carpenter's careful habit of checking measurements twice was passed to me just when I needed it most in life. If you've ever sat at a family table and felt the cold, specific weight of paperwork passed off as love, hear this clearly. I wish someone had told me the same before I signed that first small form in Dorothy's office. Inheritance should be a gift, not a debt quietly shifted onto you. If the people who are supposed to protect you hand you something and won't let you read it first, that's not family. That's a transaction pretending to be family. You are allowed to ask for time. You are allowed to hire your own lawyer. You are allowed fully and without apology to tear it in half and walk out the door. On the other side of that door, build a life made of people who never once needed your signature to prove you belonged to them. That is my story. It started with a folded page of paperwork in a coffee shop, a stack of quarterly reports on a stranger's desk, a peppermint candy dish, and page 17 that finally, After a year of small betrayals passed off as love, told me the whole truth at once. If this reminds you of a table you've sat at, tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now. If you've ever had to choose between a family's approval and your own life, I hope you already know. As I finally learned that choosing your life is worth more.